Okay, we are not lit with Lenin tonight.
No, but we always are lit with Lenin in one way or another. I'm just sharing this on Twitter because we only have 2 viewers now.
Okay.
So, anyways, let's see. We are doing Welcome to Realistically.
Yes.
A show where we rip the veil of falsity from your eyes and shine the light of reality.
Sounds good.
I just made that up impromptu.
I know, we didn't work on any intro for this.
No, we're not
going there yet.
In progress.
Yes. So last week, 2 weeks ago, we did the Henry Kissinger. We're hoping to do Friday nights this time.
Yeah.
Realistically is what we're
calling. So I'm still working on the intro. Let me know if you like the.
I still think that you need to use dialectically in it.
Yeah. I'm gonna buy the name and what dialectically should be lit with Lenin, I think.
We'll call Lit with Lenin dialectically. Then we'll have this as realistically.
And then we need a Uber brand over that encompasses historically, realistically, and dialectically.
Sounds good to me.
I don't know what if you guys have suggestions. Is anyone here even?
No, let me see if we haven't done any chats yet.
Yeah, usually let's give it 5 more minutes.
Yeah. All right. So our first interview.
Oh, we have 5 people. Okay, we do have 5 people. Please say something so we don't feel lonely.
Yes. Chat to us. We look at the chat.
Yeah.
So our first interview was with Asa Winstanley. Or is it Winstanley?
I think it's Asa, but before that, let's let me check how many people. If there's no one on YouTube, we should just wait for about 5 more minutes. It says there's 5 people, but it could be just all me.
It's all you. Oh, here, Rick's here.
Hello, Rick Solis.
All right.
Can you show them on chat? I don't know how to do that anymore.
Can you see chat?
No, you can show them on chat. Rick Solis.
Oh, I can show on stream.
Click on his name. Yes, that.
There you go. Yes. All right. So we're just kind of babbling a little bit till we get a couple more viewers. So.
Yeah, we are babbling. Matt said he's here and you should add him to the broadcast.
Where is Matt? Because I do not see Matt here.
Okay, well.
Wait, there's like a weird queue thing. Hold on.
Let's see. Okay. Well, we have 8 people now, so we're just we've only started. So yeah, today's topic is definitely gonna get us demonetized. So be sure to hit like, click on subscribe, and also donate on PayPal, Venmo, historically.substack.com, or even on a YouTube super chat. Hey, Where Pilgrim.
Hello.
And please be interactive and talk amongst yourself in the chat when we say something. Oh, today on Twitter, I needlessly got myself into a controversy with liberals.
Oh, no. Matt, say hello.
Hey, everyone.
As Esha. Esha, what did the liberals do to you, Esha?
Okay, so somebody said free, along with free Palestine, free Venezuela, free Bolivia, free hands off Hong Kong, Belarus, and every other NED-backed project, include or CIA-supported project, including Kashmir. And all these liberals are like, "Oh, you deleted Kashmir? You don't want them to be independent?" And I'm like, "Okay, you idiots, let's look at a map of Kashmir. You see the world's tallest mountain.
Yeah, but after what I think of Kosovo,
the world's tallest mountains to the west, the world's tallest mountains to the north, the world's tallest mountains to the east. So what that means is that Kashmir is going to be just like Tibet if it's not a part of India or Pakistan, and no one outside of Langley wants to free Kashmir. And instead of the Dalai Lama, what you're going to get is some ISIS-related pedophilic warlord. So, like, just because Modi's in power and he did some bad things, and he has done definitely, I wouldn't say horrific, but definitely done things to curb the rights of native Kashmiris. That is temporary. Once Modi can go out of power next year, you can restore those rights back. But once it becomes a hellhole, once it becomes like a warlord central, an ISIS warlord central with pedophilic warlords, that cannot be reversed so easily.
Yeah. So
no.
So yeah, all these liberals today are like, and I also deleted free Armenia because Armenia is already free. Like anyone who's not saying reunite the Soviet Union for any former Soviet country is talking BS, and they are doing Langley's work for them.
Plus, they better be saying 26 plus 6.
What?
They better be saying 26 plus 6.
26 years ago was when the Soviet Union.
26 plus 6.
26 plus 6, 32.
Ireland, man. If you don't want Ireland to be full, then I don't want to hear it either.
Ah, exactly. Good point. 26 plus 6. Free Ireland.
Mm-hmm. If they don't have that on the list, then screw you.
80 county.
Yep. Northern Ireland is not a real country. That is stolen from Ireland. Ireland is a real country. And then there's those colonizers who colonized the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
That other island.
Later on, we're going to have Artsy come on, and she's going to Marxist.
She's going to paint something related. But today, okay, so this is what I suspect is a limited hangout. Israel admitted that the IDF soldiers shot 3 hostages.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the people who come in defense of Israel are ridiculous people. Let me just show you these 2 tweets.
All right, here's Mandel's.
Oh, this one. Oh, yeah. She says, can you read it out, Janet, please?
Released female hostages said that when they were moved from house to house above ground, they would dress them in hijabs. Important to keep in mind as we discuss how the IDF may have mistaken 3 hostages for militants.
So wearing a scarf is... So the IDF shoots at anyone who wears a scarf, which is clearly a war crime, and this is their defense of the IDF.
Yeah.
Why should the IDF get in trouble for it? I mean, U.S. cops don't get in trouble for shooting anybody who wears a hoodie, so I don't think the IDF's going to get in trouble for this one.
Oh, no, but it is an admission that it is, like, if you're defending the IDF, you don't say their routine policy is shooting at people with scarves.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, before this, their policy was anyone holding a human shield.
Yeah, the human shield.
The human shield, that's nonsense. As I say, that's what I've said this before on Twitter. That's white people nonsense for like not feeling guilty about shooting children, because every time you have a choice to not shoot and but you are choosing to shoot and risking the death of a child for over like 90-80% of the time. And that is a colonizer's stupid excuse, and I reject the concept of a human shield. If you really need to get that person, there's always a way, and it's always a choice that you make in order you decide to sacrifice whoever you call the shield in order to not get whoever you call the bad guy.
Yeah, I just put up Radical Nations, just they outlawed ski masks in Philadelphia. I didn't know if they fully did. I know they were talking about it.
Oh, I have a ski hijab. I should let me bring that to you.
The ski hijab. She's going to get the ski hijab. All right. So
you mean the ski?
What were you saying, Matt?
You step up. Say again?
I don't know. Your audio is kind of glitchy a little.
So I got this in Russia, like to go snowboarding, and I was it works just like a ski hijab, and let me show you.
Okay. Call it a ski job. It's a ski job. It's so hard. Pun right. Ski job.
Hijab is a ski job.
Okay, let me show you. Yeah. So then, if you no, I'm wearing it maybe wrong. No, I forgot how to. Okay,
I'm about clouds.
I learned it again. Okay. First, no. This is the side. I'm gonna learn it. 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna remember how the ski job goes. So it's supposed to cover your ears.
Yeah.
And then it's supposed to come back. No, I'm not. Got it.
I'm just gonna find the eyes, and I think I got it.
Okay. So this is when you want to use it as a headband, and then you can also use it as a face mask.
Yeah.
See?
Yeah.
I got it. I could be wrong. Yeah.
They spent so much money on equipment to read people's faces.
Anyways, I don't know why I showed it to you. I'll learn tomorrow and do it properly next week.
All right. Yes, you'll have to make a video of it on properly. But you didn't read the second tweet.
John Podhort is even worse.
So this horrible tragedy involving the IDF shooting Israeli hostages reinforces the monstrous war criminality of Hamas. There's
How?
Hold on, there's a second part to this tweet. There's a reason the Geneva Conventions required combatants to wear uniforms. It is exactly this, to make sure civilians are identifiable as civilians.
Guess who wears uniforms?
Hamas wears uniforms.
They do. And then they have the headbands that are clearly label them as they are more clearly identifiable. That they have full green kind of combat suits, and they have the headbands too, and so they definitely wear uniforms.
But it's like they're wearing, and then they're taking groups of men who are definitely not uniformed, definitely have no weapons,
and they're too fat to be trained in combat arts.
But they don't have weapons, and then they're like,
and they're also not in shape. They're not climbing walls and crawling through tunnels No, they're not taking young fit men, but
they're
old.
just collecting any man they see and claiming. But that falls in the whole thing. They think every single a newborn, a baby not even born yet is Hamas to them.
Well, there's that lady. What's her name? She used to be Netanyahu's Minister of Justice. Her name escapes me, but she claimed that they give Palestinians are all snakes, and you need to kill the snakes when they're in their mother's womb.
Yep.
What's her name? Ayla Shaker.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. I remember that. Yep. So
so today's episode is it shows you how the Israel lobby killed Corbyn's campaign, even though he basically said maybe genocide is a bad idea. Like, it was very mealy-mouthed. It was better than what Bernie Sanders has ever said, but it was still mealy-mouthed.
Mhm.
Maybe genocide is a bad idea kind of speech.
Yeah.
What?
Low bar. Better than anything Bernie's ever said is a low bar on this one.
It is, of course, but it is still true.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't even say cut off diplomatic relations to Israel like Hugo Chavez or anything. Oh, Hugo Chavez actually cut off diplomatic relations with Israel. Nothing like that. But it talks about how the British media and the Israeli lobby conspired to kill Corbyn's campaign with like fake smearing of his alleged anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Which was not true at all. In fact, Jewish members of the Labour Party were actually expunged en masse because they allegedly said anti-Semitic things, which is really ironic. To mass expel Jews from your party, it's really strange. And he does a really great job detailing it in his book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So I'm going to play that video now, then we're going to come back. When we come back, Artsy Marxist is going to join us. She's going to start painting, and then we have another interview.
Yeah, we'll have Sahar Aziz, Dr. Sahar Aziz and Mitchell Plitnik.
Yes. All right. So let me throw this on. Everything's saved up here. Now I have a million things. All right. See you back.
To be with you. It's Esha, right?
Yep. And it's actually great. I read your book, as I already mentioned on Twitter.
Yeah.
Wait, what happened?
Sorry, that was me.
Can you take us off camera?
started reading it on the plane, and every other word out of my mouth was mother. Which will be, and so I had to stop reading that because that's just like it made me very angry. But it was a great book.
Thank you. Well, thanks for that. I wasn't trying to make people angry, but it is an infuriating situation for sure. And you know, I have had quite a lot of responses like that. From readers.
Yeah, for me at least, when I saw Jeremy Corbyn be the leader of Labour, it was a time of big hope for me. I was so excited. I was like, maybe things will be different now. And then to see him being, I mean, like, he's as good as it gets possible in England. And then to see him systematically get destroyed, it just broke my heart.
Yeah, I think a lot of people had that experience. For sure, you know.
So,
and that, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's why that's why I put the epigraph in the beginning about Corbyn when he was speaking to Glastonbury Music Festival in front of hundreds of thousands of people. I just felt that moment sort of captured something. You know, there was a lot of hope. You know,
for me, at least, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. What made you write this book?
Well, I've been reporting on the story for 8 years now, really. And by the time I came to start writing the book in 2019, I had several years of reporting to draw on. And it just seemed like the kind of story that would benefit from a book because it was an ongoing issue and it never ended, you know, and it's still going on now. You know, there could, you know, if the book is successful enough, for sure there could be a second edition because there's so many things that have happened since this book went to print even. It's a really interminable story. There were so many things that happened over the years, and I think it benefits from a book because it was an ongoing story, and it was really hard to keep up with it. It was hard to keep up with the reality of what happened. And I've had several readers now telling me that they thought they knew everything there was to know about this, but then after reading my book, they learned a lot of new things as well. Yeah, so when I actually came to sit down and write the book, I realized a lot of new things. There was a lot of things that I hadn't realized until I actually came to research and to tie the whole story together, tie the whole ongoing narrative together. And I think it's the kind of story that really benefits from a book. And that's essentially why.
Okay. So let's get to the substance of the history. So you, in the beginning, you kind of mentioned the transformation of the Labour Party from a party of the working class to a more neoliberal party.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the Labour Party is ostensibly a socialist party. It began at the beginning, really, of the 20th century, although it drew on older movements across Britain, Wales, England, and Scotland. Essentially, it was the Labour movement was very strong in Wales, where I'm from, especially in the working class areas of Wales, in the south, the industrial areas, and industrial areas all over Britain, and the Labour Party began as a way for the working classes, the proletariat, it really was an industrial proletariat, to assert political power really for the first time. And so there was a lot of hope in that regard. And after the Second World War, there was all kinds of struggles. There was all kinds of working class struggles. And after the Second World War, the Labour Party won its really most emphatic election victory, creating the modern welfare state, creating the national health system, through healthcare at the point of use, creating, a social security net, nationalization of key industries, steel, coal, the rails, things were already heading in that direction anyway before the 1945. In 1945, of course, the end of the Second World War was the key election victory for the Labour Party. And they came to power despite the fact that the Tory leader, the Conservative Party opponent, was the war leader, Winston Churchill, who was incredibly popular as an individual within the country because he had, from the British point of from the parochial British point of view, Winston Churchill had won the Second World War. Although, of course, we know it was really the Soviets that did that, defeated the Nazis, and Britain played a minor role at best. So the Labour Party, in that respect, represented the majority of the British working class. The problem with the Labour Party, though, was that it was always an imperialist party. So even when the best Labour governments, relatively speaking, ran it, they did not dismantle the British Empire. They ran the British Empire. They contributed to the British Empire. They expanded the British Empire. For example, in what was then known as Malaya, they fought that it was Labour governments who I'm pretty sure, I remember that it was Labour governments who fought against the insurgents, communists, the leftist insurgents in what was then Malaya and modern day Malaysia. And that was a very brutal counterinsurgency that the British carried out. Harold Wilson, again, not quite as left-wing as Jeremy Corbyn, but a relatively left-wing Labour prime minister, wanted to send troops to Vietnam on behalf of the Americans. He didn't do it in the end, but he certainly wanted to do it. I think there was some sort of military involvement clandestinely.
Oh, yeah.
So, there's this long history there. But during the so there was all problems with the Labour Party, but at least domestically it did have some good policies at certain points. Now, that all changed in the era of neoliberalism. Exactly. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, that era. From Thatcher's victory in 1979, the Labour Party began to move in a much more corporate direction.
Is there a reason why it did it, or is it, do you think, opportunism?
I think, well, yes, opportunism definitely is a large part of it. I think as well there is a very powerful deep state in Britain, like there is in America. You know, there's a permanent military and intelligence apparatus which has no democratic accountability and has a massive amount of sway over how the country is run. And always has done, you know, in America and especially in Britain. Like the MI5, the MI6 are very powerful, and they've done things in the past to even kind of to not only to try and overthrow Labour governments, but even Tory governments that they found that weren't hard line enough. So I think, you know, there's these kinds of factors, but there was essentially first of all, there was a leader called Neil Kinnock who started off on the left. And, you know, he was even a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He was against nuclear weapons, but he moved right. He was an incredibly opportunist. And he moved right, and he moved the Labour Party in a really kind of neoliberal direction, ultimately, which culminated in Tony Blair. And Tony Blair took over the Labour Party.
With Neil Kinnock, it's really funny. When Joe Biden was running for president the first time in 1988, he actually plagiarized an entire Neil Kinnock speech.
Yeah.
Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why is Gladys the first woman in her family, in 1,000 generations, to be able to get to university?
My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania don't come up after 12 hours and play football.
8 hours underground, and then come up and play football.
It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
There was no platform upon which they could stand.
But for me, what was really very enlightening was around 1995, there was a speech by Margaret Thatcher where she kind of says that the biggest victory they which we'll play right now.
We Conservatives changed Britain for the better, and we helped to change the world, bringing liberty to millions who'd never have known it. Moreover, let's admit it, we've changed our opponents, at least on the surface, and so made them electable, and that's tough. But we didn't, and we couldn't, make them believers in liberty or champions of enterprise. New Labour's main appeal, when you get down to it, is quite simply that it's not old Labour. And that's true as far as it goes. I had some respect for the old Labour Party, which stood for certain principles, wrong as they were. But today's Labour Party has no discernible principles at all. It is rootless, empty, and artificial.
This was an interesting one because when I came to research this, I slightly suspect that it may have not been a real quote. It might have been one of those kind of famous misquotes.
I tweeted out this video before on Twitter.
Right, so there is absolutely. So when I came to research it, there is absolutely, you know, there's legitimate sources for this. You know, that she did say this. She said that she was asked about her greatest victory, and it was Tony Blair because we forced our opponents to change. Tony Blair and New Labour because we forced our opponents to change their minds.
And so then with Tony Blair, he embraced all of the neoliberalism. I remember there's a speech where he says there's going to be no more class war, like no more bosses and no more, we're all on the same team. Exactly. And he privatized a lot of things. And And then Corbyn represented a rejection of Blairism in 2015. And one thing I'm trying to understand is what is the connection to the Israel lobby that is very strong in both sides of the pond?
Yes, it's an interesting one. So politically, Tony Blair was very much part of the Atlanticist trend in Britain. So
what does that mean for people who are not promoting?
So pro-American, essentially. That not only did he begin privatizing anything he could get anything he could get his hands on, even making, it was Tony Blair who first took away free university tuition. He started to, for the first time, impose tuition fees. This will date me to British viewers and listeners, but when I went to university, I was the very final year that it was free. When my uncle went to university, like way back in the 60s, when he went to university, he had a full. Not only was there no fees, it was completely unheard of. It was free university education, but there was actually a grant. He got money to go to university. By the time I went to university, there was almost no grant, but at least I went for free. But I was the very final year that did that, just before Tony Blair's new tuition fees came in. Now, by today's standards of ridiculous, incredibly large tuition fees, still not as high as America, but I believe it's around 10 grand a year now, £10,000. Or more, probably. I'm not really sure, but it's a lot of money. I know that. When it first started, it was only £1,000 a year. But I say only, it's a lot of money for a lot of people. But now compared to what it is now, that looks like not very much. But the point, he started that. It was Tony Blair who started that. It wasn't the Tories. So he was very much carrying on Thatcher's legacy in domestic policies, but also in foreign affairs. So he was a massive warmonger, essentially. He participated in the dismantling of Yugoslavia in the late 90s. He invaded Afghanistan, invaded Iraq, and he would have invaded more countries if he'd not been deposed by his own party because he started to become really unpopular in the country.
Absolutely. So now. And it's interesting how Corbyn came to power because he. Do you want to quickly talk about that in 2015?
Yeah, it is really interesting because the only way it was possible, it was kind of a miracle now looking back on it.
Yeah.
And it would never happen now because of the experience of the Labour right.
Yep, and. Go ahead, and then I'll give my 2 cents later.
Yeah. So the way it happened was before 2015, the Labour Party MPs had chosen the leader. There could be some input from membership, but basically the MPs chose it. Uh-huh. But what happened in 2014, 2015, there was a renegotiation of how Labour Party's internal rules worked. Mm-hmm. So it made it wider. It opened it up. It made it easier for more people to vote in internal Labour Party elections. So we don't have in this country primaries like they have in the US. So like in the US, basically anyone can vote in the Democratic or Republican parties' primaries. You just have to register as a Republican or Democratic voter. Yeah. It's pretty simple. Over here, generally speaking, you have to be a member of that party, like a dues. You have to pay your monthly dues to that party. You have to be a card-carrying member, essentially, to vote in the internal elections, to decide on candidates for whatever offices, including the leader of the party. So what that meant was it was a relatively small electorate. But in 2014-15, that was opened up, and there was complicated reasons for that. But one of them was essentially that the right wing of the Labour Party wanted Tony Blair back, or at least a Tony Blair-esque figure. So Tony Blair has been succeeded by his accomplice, Gordon Brown, who was another central part of the New Labour project. But then Gordon Brown, after losing an election, was succeeded by Ed Miliband, whose father was actually this renowned Marxist theoretician called Ralph Miliband, who wrote some really
was actually shocked to learn that he's so Ed Miliband is so center-laced.
He is, yeah. So he's part of he's not as right-wing as his brother David Miliband, who is kind of a new Tony Blair in waiting, but Ed Miliband is certainly part of what's known as the soft left. He's a kind of centrist, essentially. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And so because the hard Blairites, the hard right-wingers didn't like Ed Miliband, they wanted to have new rules for when Ed Miliband lost election to succeed him. They wanted to have new rules that would open the party up. Now, like I said, the Blairism, the New Labour, was part of this kind of Atlanticist pro-US position where they saw themselves very much like the Clintons in the US. They very self-consciously saw themselves as this kind of quote-unquote third way. We're not going to be socialists. We're not going to be conservatives. We're going to be the third way. Of course, it was a lot of rubbish because they were essentially conservatives, really, in their policies.
Yeah.
It started, the rule change started as a product of the right because they were so deluded. They thought they thought Tony Blair was still popular in the country when he wasn't.
Yeah.
So they thought if they opened it up to more voters, then all these Blairites would flood into the party and they would have a new Tony Blair kind of figure be leader of the Labour Party. But the opposite happened. Like all the old left re-entered the party and lots of young people who were sick of neoliberalism entered the party for the first time and elected Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing MP.
I know. I remember in September, it was like September of 2015. I was so happy. It was, so this is where, until now, it seems like the British media was not really doing a concerted effort to do their propaganda blitz against Jeremy Corbyn, right?
They were doing a concerted effort against Jeremy Corbyn.
No. I thought they didn't do it until he started running for, they considered him to be a backbencher, not important, but...
Right. I see what you mean, yes. So, yes, that's right. There wasn't a lot. The general British strategy against Jeremy Corbyn until 2015 was generally to ignore him because he was a backbencher. He was a Labour MP, but he was not considered to be particularly relevant. He was considered like the mainstream British media would often call him or his tendency, to the extent that they covered him at all, which was very rarely. They would call him like the loony left kind of thing, and it was just an example of like these crazy socialists who want these terrible things like equality for black and brown people, nationalization of the rails, renationalization of the railways, which is a massively popular policy, protection of the NHS and peace overseas and all these kinds of
wars.
things. Yeah. So, so he was kind of ignored in that way. But the pro-Israel newspapers didn't ignore him because they kind of saw him as the threat of a bad example from their perspective.
Or a good example.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, in 1961, there was a memo written by the State Department where they were explaining what the threat Cuba posed to the United States. And it was like, Cuba is a threat of a good example because if people start looking at Cuba, people in Latin America will start demanding things like food and housing.
Yeah, so that's really interesting that you mentioned that, Esha, because I thought it was very similar, like what happened in the Labour Party. There was a kind of counter revolutionary insurgency inside the Labour Party to get rid of Corbyn by his. So there, at one point in the book, I described them as Contras in suits because that's what they were. There was a revolution, basically a kind of political revolution inside the Labour Party, and all these counter-revolutionary Blairites. All these MPs and bureaucrats who still dominated the Labour Party despite the fact Corbyn had seized the leadership. He had been elected overwhelmingly by the membership. They just refused to, like the Contras, refusing to accept the revolution that deposed the dictator Somoza. And like, the counter-revolutionary forces in Latin America today, they refused to accept elections in Venezuela. They refused to accept the revolutionary government of Cuba that overthrew the previous dictator, and so on and so forth. These people, these counter-revolutionaries, just saw themselves as entitled to run the Labour Party forever, so they didn't care about democratic legitimacy. They just wanted to overthrow it by any means necessary.
Yeah, I read the Labour leaks. Some things were shocking. One thing that was shocking is actually these two employees of the Labour Party saying that they want to burn this mentally disabled man to death or something like that. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's right. Yes. That's right. Yeah, so he was, suffering from depression, and they were basically using kind of mental health slurs against him, saying they, putting, you couldn't fully tell, but it was petrol can emojis in the messages.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. So for me, the earliest smears of anti-Semitism were overly ridiculous. Like, one thing that you mentioned is that, let me read in your book. Okay. In July of 2018, 3 pro-Israel British newspapers published identical front-page editorials claiming that Corbyn-led government posed an existential threat to Jewish life in this country due to the Corbynite contempt for Jews in Israel.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely crazy stuff. This is a man who's been an anti-racist his whole life, including opposing anti-Semitism, which does exist, of course, from the far right. And that was just a whole, and that was from the pro-Israel newspapers that I mentioned earlier, the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News, who are very right-wing newspapers that are very pro-Israel. So, they knew Corbyn as a campaigner for Palestinian rights, and they wanted to oppose him for that reason, and they would use any slur necessary. There was even more crazy stuff than that said, where
Simon Heffer. Let's actually, okay,
that's a good one.
Okay, we'll put that radio quote right here. This is where we'll edit that in, because I think people won't believe us if we...
Yeah. Crazy.
This country, that if we do have a general election at the moment, we're going to face a choice between Coco the Clown's degenerate younger brother and a man who wants to reopen Auschwitz. I mean, this is just terrible.
No, I can't let you get away with that. You cannot say that.
You can't say that.
But I mean, why has he turned a blind eye to all these rabid anti-Semites in his
home?
Hang on,
you cannot say that the leader of the Labour Party, whatever you think of him, would intend to do that. That really is.
I'm sure in 1933 they had similar conversations in Germany. And
okay.
So yeah, there's no words for it. And then the one that was really shocking was, not shocking because it's of course the Daily Mail, and just so we want to remember, the Daily Mail founder, there's like a picture of the Daily Mail founder with Hitler saying, "Dear Mr. Hitler, I'm a big supporter," whatever. So it's really two-faced when the Daily Mail starts accusing people of anti-Semitism. But one shocking one is Labour must kill vampire Jezza. That was just like, it seems like they just had no bounds of decency that they used to adhere to, right?
Yeah, and it really, you could tell it got to Corbyn as well, personally. He found it hard to deal with, as anyone would, really. But, he wasn't prepared for it, I don't think, which
no,
is disappointing, but that's the way it went.
He should have fired all the Blairites from every Labour position, and also, traded his own independent press, which Bernie tried a little bit better, but still that was not enough. But they both should have fought harder, but that's another story. And so I guess I'm trying to, okay, so in 2015, the Media Reform Coalition, this is what you meant, says that the press set out to systematically undermine Jeremy Corbyn during his first week as Labour leader with a barrage of overwhelmingly negative coverage. Their study found that out of 494 articles on Corbyn that week, 60% were negative and only 13% was positive. So that is definitely a propaganda blitz against Corbyn.
Yeah, there was really systematic opposition against him. The whole British media was opposed to him, including the ostensibly liberal media, especially the liberal media. The Guardian, the Guardian was his number one enemy, really.
Nick Cohen. I remember Nick Cohen's awful pieces all the time.
Right. Yeah. Well, those would be interesting to visit now in light of the very serious allegations against him.
Do you want to tell people about the new serious allegation? I was very interested.
Well, I haven't. There's a piece in the New York Times that came out this week that we're filming this, where Nick Cohen, who was a very prominent liberal columnist, former Guardian columnist now, very prominent as a kind of liberal critic of so-called left-wing extremism and what he alleges actually is left-wing anti-Semitism and all this kind of stuff.
Who raided most of the concentration camps?
Yeah, the Soviet Union.
Marxist-Leninists.
Yeah, exactly. He has now been... there's been some very serious allegations of sexual harassment against him. And this story was broken not by the British press, which hates criticism, but by the New York Times. I haven't read the New York Times piece in detail yet, but it looks to be credible and serious. And the story was known about by the British press, by the Financial Times, but they killed the story. So yeah, it would be. That's a good point. It'd be interesting to kind of revisit his body of work in that light.
I will do that later. So then in your book, you also mention this organization called the Palestinian Return Center and Jeremy Corbyn's relationship with it and how it affected the propaganda blitz. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting example because the Palestinian Return Center is just this small organization based in London run by Palestinians. So it's not, it's a Palestinian, you could say it's a Palestinian solidarity organization in a way, but it's run by actual Palestinians. And, it's a small organization. It's kind of a moderate campaigning, in the best sense of the word, a moderate campaigning group. And they just try and raise awareness of the Palestinian right to return, and that's why it's called the Palestinian Return Center. They raise awareness and they hold events focusing on the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe when 800,000 Palestinians were expelled by the Zionist militias.
The Haganah and the other one.
Yeah, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern gang.
Yeah, yep.
The gangs the Zionist gangs, terrorist organizations, really, that were then founded the Israeli army, were then integrated into the Israeli army. They expelled deliberately 800,000 Palestinians, and those Palestinians have still not been allowed to return to their homes today. Them and their ancestors, and them and their descendants now number in the millions. And because Israel is a racist state, what Israeli NGO B'Tselem calls a regime of Jewish supremacy and a regime of apartheid between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, they don't want Palestinians in historic Palestine, present-day Israel, because they're not Jewish, plainly and simply. And so that's the issue that the Palestinian Return Center campaigns around. And they, you can call them activists in a way, I suppose, but they're not activisty in the sense of they're not really leading demonstrations or certainly not direct actions in that kind of way. They're more sort of a campaigning and an awareness-raising group. But despite the nature of the group and how sort of moderate it is, you could say, it's become an enemy of Israel. Like Israel has made it like one of its really key enemies. And Israel is always doing these kind of defamation campaigns against it, saying it's sort of linked to terrorists and all this kind of rubbish. And perhaps because of that, to offer some solidarity, or I don't know all the exact reasons why, just generally because he's a supporter of Palestinian liberation and Palestine solidarity campaigning. Jeremy Corbyn was a supporter of the group and he spoke at its events sometimes. And, these kinds of groups, they like to have MPs coming to their events because it gives them some kind of institutional cachet and some sort of protection as well, I suppose, from these kind of false allegations that the Israeli government puts against it. It was one of these speeches that Jeremy Corbyn made that was then used against him later when he was leader of the Labour Party to kind of really manufacture a smear against him.
And also you mentioned, this kind of gets more closer to your book theme about weaponizing anti-Semitism. So later on, you mentioned that there is a British, maybe an NGO, a charity that is allegedly there to combat anti-Semitism, but then what they're doing is really defaming people who are not supportive of the Israeli state. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the main one, or the biggest one, I suppose you could say, is the Community Security Trust, the CST. Uh-huh. So the CST is Britain's equivalent in a lot of ways to the ADL in America.
Oh, my God.
The so-called Anti-Defamation League.
Don't even get me started on the Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah, there's a long history to both of these groups. Go on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I was just saying that last year, the Anti-Defamation League ended up accusing rabbis of being anti-Semitic accidentally or on purpose. I don't know how they did it.
Yeah. Well, the CST does very similar things where it says that left-wing Jewish supporters of Jeremy Corbyn are sort of, they come close to calling them anti-Semitic. At least they say they're sort of extremists or all this kind of thing.
Well, in the U.S., what the ADL did is there's a sect of Judaism where where these rabbis are very strongly anti-Zionist because they don't believe. So because of that, they've been smeared and accused of being anti-Semitic by the ADL. And these are very orthodox, very, very religious rabbis who adhere to all the tenets very, very strictly.
Yeah, we have the same thing here. The Neturei Karta and the Satmar sects of Orthodox Judaism in largely in North London and in other cities. They're very incredibly anti-Zionist, and the CST actually some years ago put together a kind of secret document, a secret dossier on the Neturei Karta and also other secular Jewish anti-Zionists, and they sent this to the government. And they accused them of being extremists. There was an article I did more than a decade ago where a secret document that the CST did kind of defaming anti-Zionists. It was a secret document that came out in a court case that I covered, and it showed that the CST, it portrays itself as, in the same way to the ADL, as almost like a civil rights group, as like it's just a group kind of monitoring and combating anti-Jewish prejudice, anti-Semitism. But in secret, both groups have this agenda where they're essentially Israel lobby organizations, and they work behind the scenes with government and other organizations to kind of combat really Israel and delegitimize Israel's enemies and even spy on pro-Palestinian groups. And so that's what both groups have done on both sides of the Atlantic. Stories I've done over the years show that the CST very much does play that role. So this secret document from the CST, it was sent to the government, and it was kind of a dossier on the Neturei Karta anti-Zionist Jewish group. Like you mentioned, it's similar to the contemporaries in the US, religious anti-Zionists who oppose Israel on religious principle, but also on human rights principles. And because of that, the CST kind of attacked them in this secret McCarthyist document that they sent to the government, and saying that, well, they're extremists and you shouldn't take what they say in support of Palestinian rights seriously. And they did a similar thing. In that document was also mentioned several well-known secular anti-Zionist Jews who had put out statements supporting Palestinians. So the CST works very closely with British government departments, so they have a lot of influence in that way. And they worked against Jeremy Corbyn a lot, like a lot of other pro-Israel groups.
Yeah, and one thing, going back to the national security state, there was one statement made by both Mike Pompeo, who was back then the Secretary of State, and by British intelligence services, that they would actually do a coup if Corbyn got elected.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of, to look back on it now, this is kind of astonishing. It was all done in plain sight,
Yeah.
All this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, all this stuff was done in plain sight. And it's like, imagine if they're saying all this openly, imagine what they were doing secretly behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I think there's still a lot we don't know. And I've tried to, probably more stuff will come out in the future, but I've tried to start writing the kind of history of what was done. So just to raise the examples that you mentioned. So there was a story that came out in 2019, in the spring of June 2019, only a few months before the general election in Britain, what turned out to be the general election in Britain, but at a time when there was expected to be a general election at any time, because it was quite a sort of unstable time in the country. A story came out, a big story in the Washington Post, when the then Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, former CIA director, was recorded. There was a leaked recording of him, and he had a meeting with several pro-Israel organizations in the US. And what he's quoted as saying in that article as, quote, "It could be that Mr. Corbyn manages to run the gauntlet and get elected." So they're talking about, he's got a chance of becoming prime minister, because he had come very close already in 2017. Yeah. And then the quote continues, "It's possible. You should know. We won't wait for him to do those things to begin to push back. We will do our level best. It's too risky and too important and too hard once it's already happened." So he's talking about quite openly about essentially performing a coup against Corbyn before he even became prime minister. So what did he mean by that? What was he doing? What were they doing behind the scenes? We don't fully know, but they're openly saying it, that they're going to do it. And as you mentioned, the British press was similar.
Oh, yeah. And for me, of course, the U.S. has done this. I mean, every color revolution, they've brought up the media institutions. They've done many color revolutions. So we don't, there is a lot to be, a lot to have it. A lot to be known. One thing is that why did the Israel lobby see Corbyn as such a big threat to them?
Well, he was, as you mentioned, the threat of a good example. Really, that's what it was. It's kind of, again, it's this Cold War thing. It's domino theory. He was only one MP, and he was one of a small group of left-wing MPs who remained in the Labour Party. They managed to just sort of carve their little niche. They were on the back benches. They were asking their own questions. They were going to rallies and protests and demonstrations, leading meetings, chairing meetings, adding their names to petitions and so on. They were basically campaigners in that way, but they had this backbench role where they could challenge their own leadership. Tony Corbyn and a small group of his other colleagues rebelled against Tony Blair many, many times, just voted against his Labour government policies that were things like the war in Iraq or privatization and so forth. They rebelled against them. And so they were kind of a thorn in the side to the right-wing leadership of the Labour Party in that way. But as well, you could argue that, and probably what Tony Blair possibly did argue, was that it was useful to have this left-wing fringe within the Labour Party in a way, because in the philosophy of keep your friends close and your enemies closer, so he kept his enemies in the Labour Party, which gave them the kind of foot soldiers of Labour members who could then be used during general elections, because with all the money in the world, they still need people, boots on the ground. But the Labour Party had been hollowed out over the years during the Blairite years, and when Corbyn ran for the leadership, about 200 people joined the Labour Party just to vote for him. But
200,000, you mean?
What did I say?
200.
Oh, yes, 200,000. Yeah, 200,000 people joined the Labour Party. And now up to 200,000 people have been purged from the Labour Party or left the Labour Party in disgust because of the purging of Corbyn.
Yeah, I mean, Corbyn himself is no longer a member of the Labour Party. Chris Williamson from Darwin, he made one of the most... we've had him on the show before. He made one of the most bland remarks about Israel, and he was deemed anti-Semitic and purged.
That's right. Yeah. Chris Williamson was one of the left-wing MPs. I mean, he was really the strongest. He was the only MP who really said that these anti-Semitism smears were anti-Semitism smears. And because of that, his card was really marked by the Israel lobby. And so what I was starting to say and what you'd asked me about was the reason for the Israel lobby and why they found Corbyn such a threat. So he's on this left-wing fringe of the Labour Party, but he was always a strong campaigner for Palestinian rights. You know, he'd be at the demonstrations. You know, I spoke on platforms with him over the years, long before he was sort of famous. You know, that's why so many people joined the Labour Party when he ran, because everyone at the grassroots knew who he was. Yeah. In a way that the mainstream media maybe necessarily didn't.
No, he was there for the Iraq war protest in 2003. Exactly. He came to he was one of the few British people who managed to come to Washington D.C. and speak. So we all. Yeah. So that was one thing that was really, this almost classifies as election interference. So BBC has a show called Panorama where they kind of deep dive on a subject each week. And maybe 1 month before the actual election, sometime in mid-November of 2019, they had an entire episode dedicated to, is Labour anti-Semitic? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was actually a few months before the election.
A few months. Sorry, I got my timeline confused.
No, it's okay. But the point stands because it was a time, I believe it was July of 2019. But your point actually still stands because it was at a time of instability in the country due to the Brexit negotiations, when the government was quite unstable, and the Tory government had a new leader, Boris Johnson, but he didn't have any kind of democratic legitimacy. Right, because he'd only been elected by his own party membership, and the Tory party was.
Theresa May quit.
Yeah, and the Tory party is just a really small membership. The Labour Party, at least under Corbyn, it had around between 500,000 and 600,000 members, something like that. And so it had more of a democratic legitimacy in that way, or more of a mass base at least. And so the point is that at that time that Panorama released this documentary, it was known that there was going to be an election. It could be any day soon, really. It was announced at the last minute, really. So yes, absolutely, it was an attempt to influence elections. Although John Pilger, the brilliant journalist. Yeah, one of my journalistic heroes, absolutely. He did a really good documentary about the NHS and about how successive Labour, new Labour and Conservative governments are trying to sell it off, essentially, and trying to privatise it. That documentary was not allowed to be shown before the elections. It was deemed to be, partisan, and that it would have to wait until after the election until it was broadcast. And so, it shows how really the British political and public system is really kind of fixed. But this documentary was really, it was really dishonest in my view.
Yeah, and there was also an attempt, maybe it was right before the election in 2017, before the snap election, where all these Blairite MPs tried to do a coup by quitting. Do you remember?
That's right.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So just to say, first of all, the Panorama documentary you mentioned was titled, "Is Labour Anti-Semitic?" In other words, is Corbyn's Labour anti-Semitic? It was a loaded question because their answer was very much yes.
It's like, do you beat your wife?
Yeah, yeah, it is. It was exactly like that. And it was completely biased. Like, all the people in it were basically claiming anti-Semitism, were basically pro-Israel campaigners. And they didn't even disclose that in the documentary. They just presented these figures as these normal Jewish members of the Labour Party, when actually they were the leading activists within the Jewish Labour movement, which is this pro-Israel, pro-Zionist organization, which was against Corbyn from the start. So there's that. So, sorry, what was your other question?
Oh, about the attempted coup by the in 2017, maybe 2016.
Right. Yes. So 2016 was when it came, the coup. There was a coup attempt by Corbyn's MPs. And again, it was a time of instability in the country where there was expected to be, again, you know, there'd been the Brexit referendum. So the Brexit referendum took place in 2016.
Yes, I remember that.
And there was a whole, you know, throughout that whole period, really, from 2016 to 2019, it was expected that there would be elections at any time, but partly because of those negotiations and partly because the Tory government was not stable. So it was a really interesting and kind of almost electrifying time when Corbyn was the leader of the party. But as I mentioned, these contras in suits, the Labour Party MPs were not refusing to accept the democratic legitimacy of the membership electing Jeremy Corbyn as leader, and they wanted to get rid of him by any means necessary. And the method they chose to do that was an internal party coup where they voted in no confidence motions against Corbyn and just basically called on him to stand down as leader of the Labour Party and just be replaced. Now, bear in mind, this was June, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but it was certainly in the early part of 2016. So it's really only a few months that Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, because he was elected in September of 2015.
Yeah.
And then only a few months into 2016, they're trying to get rid of him already. Well, Corbyn refused to do that, and rightfully so, because he said, I've only just been elected. I haven't had a chance to put my programme to the general electorate of the country. And the membership of the party supports me. And so they rallied around him. And they defeated the coup. There was
he actually won the second time in a bigger proportion than the first.
That's right. So there was a second leadership election, within months, although there was no reason to have one, but they had one anyway, and he won it again with a bigger proportion. And so what's quite interesting about that coup attempt, which a lot of people, even in the grassroots, forget, is that coup attempt was led by Margaret Hodge, who was this pro-Israel figure.
Okay, yeah. Can you tell us more about it? About Margaret Hodge.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Margaret Hodge she was one of these right-wing MPs. She was very pro-Blairite. During the New Labour years, she was a junior minister in New Labour governments. But she was on the right of the party, and she was not a member technically, because they don't technically have a membership, but she was listed as a supporter of Labour Friends of Israel, which is this pro-Israel lobby organization. Really, as I show in the book, it's actually a front, really, for the Israeli embassy. It works incredibly. It was caught on camera admitting to being essentially a front for the Israeli embassy.
Was that in the Al Jazeera documentary?
That's right. It's in the Al Jazeera documentary. Its own staff member is on camera saying, we have this identity as separate from the Israeli embassy, but in reality, we actually work really, really closely together. And we talk to the, Shai, this Israeli embassy agent, which we talk to Shai most days. And so they're basically admitting on camera to being a cutout for the Israeli embassy within the Labour Party.
So they are literally an agent of a foreign wing. Imagine if Russia had that within the Labour Party.
If Russia had done that, you can just imagine the response would have been very, very different, very different.
Yesterday, Kit Clarenberg, a friend of the show, he's been on the show before, he also works at Grey Zone, was interrogated by the by the police in Britain when he arrived back in Britain from Serbia. And he was accused of being an FSB agent just because he wrote some articles against Paul Mason and certain leaks about the war in Russia. And when he has absolutely no connection with Russia. So, so this is like kind of the witch hunt they already do. And if like, exactly, Russia had that there would be like a non-stop media storm.
Yeah, it would have been absolutely insane. Kit, I've written articles with Kit. We just did a piece yesterday, just come out yesterday, about Adam Smith International, which is a really interesting one.
Tell us a little bit about it later. Okay, go on.
Yeah, Kit does some really important work, and he was detained under this draconian British so-called counter-terror law a few weeks ago. The story just came out yesterday, and it is really shocking. You know, he's being detained by the British government for 5 hours, having his devices confiscated for the crime of doing, the so-called crime of doing accurate journalism. They didn't charge him with they didn't even suspect him of any wrongdoing. No. But this is the draconian nature of the British so-called counter-terror law. Yeah, it's disgraceful. So, yes, Labour Friends of Israel is absolutely an agent of a foreign power. And in my view, you could even say it's an agent of a hostile foreign power. Certainly it was hostile against the left-wing leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. There was it was a really crazy situation whereby so you have Margaret Hodge, who was a supporter of Labour Friends of Israel, and she became one of Corbyn's most adamant and vocal opponents in the Labour Party, and she really did her best, and she really worked hard against him, and she called him an anti-Semite and a racist, and because of that.
Okay. But the thing about it is that Corbyn, you can see from the 1970s where he actually got arrested for fighting against apartheid.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was no basis. They never gave any basis to what they were saying. It was a complete smear and a complete lie. And yet it was accepted by the mainstream British media just because all these pro-Israel organisations were saying it, essentially. And that's what it came down to. And it was Margaret Hodge. What a lot of people forget, it was Margaret Hodge who launched this coup attempt in 2016. People put it down to Hilary Benn, who is this right-wing Labour MP. Yeah, he was involved. He had his own parallel coup plot against Corbyn too. But it was Margaret Hodge who was the first to come out, and actually she proposed the no confidence motion against Corbyn, which was voted in favour of overwhelmingly by Labour by I believe it was 3/4 of Labour Party MPs, because the party was the MPs were not elected they weren't chosen by the membership.
No.
They were just sort of imposed from the top, and they were there in place from previous right-wing leaderships.
So, now I want to slightly switch gears. After Corbyn resigned and then we got Keir Starmer, have they changed the rules to kind of stop a new Corbyn from coming around?
Yeah, they have. They've done several things. The main thing they've done is to purge the party. So they've purged the membership.
For anti-Semitism?
For the most part, yes. For alleged anti-Semitism, for the most part, yeah.
And how have they done this purge? Like, what have they? What is the criteria for this purge?
So it's like basically anyone who gets accused of anti-Semitism in any way, whether there's any basis or not, is now basically suspended or expelled from the party. It's they'll basically use anything, and people have left the party as well. People have left in disgust and at the way that others have been kicked out of the party, and they have also changed the rules. They've now made it harder. Like Corbyn would never, under the new rules, Corbyn would never have got onto the ballot. So to get onto the ballot in the first place, for the members to even vote and choose in the first place, you had to have had the nominations of a percentage of Labour Party MPs. Corbyn only very narrowly got that.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of grassroots lobbying to do that. And at the time, there was like several sort of soft left MPs who voted for him. They didn't support him. They didn't want him to be leader, but they wanted him to be on the ballot so that the election would have more legitimacy. What they really wanted was for him to come last place. But then what happened? They didn't expect what happened to actually happen, and some of them then later said, "Oh, we were morons for doing this." So, that was Margaret Beckett, a former New Labour minister, who said that. She called herself a moron, essentially. So what happened was that yes, they've now changed the rules. They've tightened that up now. They've made it. The percentage of MPs who need to nominate someone for leader is high. I don't know the exact figure, but it's higher now, and it would be impossible, essentially, for a leftist like Corbyn to get on the ballot.
So, and it seems like on both sides of the Atlantic, in Britain, you can at least speak in mainstream about certain Palestinian rights. In the US, that's not even going to happen. It seems like any kind of advocacy for Palestinian rights is going to be quashed down by people or actually the money that supports Israel. And in the US, what people don't realize is that the biggest pro-Israeli lobby is Christians for Zionism, and they have no relation to Judaism. And in fact, one of the pastors who used to lead it praised Hitler. So it's very... Yeah. So unfortunately, this means that it seems like it's always like an uphill battle to say anything about Palestinian rights or even talk about the history of the formation of the State of Israel. What do you think people like? Is this fight possible to prolong? If so, how?
Yeah, I think it's still possible. Absolutely. I mean, if you push back, there's definitely things that can be done. But it is becoming increasingly harder in Britain. Yeah, I think over these anti-Semitism smears have had such a negative effect, really, on political culture in this country. It has become increasingly hard to advocate for Palestinian rights. Absolutely, it's really interesting about the Christian Zionists because, in terms of membership, at least, the Christians United for Israel that you mentioned is. Claims to have more than 2 million members. I don't know how accurate that claim is, but there's no doubt there's a massive constituency for right-wing evangelical Christian groups in the US who have a lot of political sway and influence and who are overwhelmingly, certainly in terms of the leadership, overwhelmingly pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. Like they say that the Jews are going to have to convert to Christianity in the end times or they'll be slaughtered in the fiery pits of hell or whatever. They
want to create Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. He was also a dominionist, and his thing is he wanted to start a war between Iran and Israel because something in the Bible says something about Babylon needs to be fighting with Israel in order to bring about the apocalypse.
They have these kind of weird theologies, and it doesn't, which is anti-Semitic, and yet it doesn't stop Israeli governments from being friendly with them. That pastor's name is John Hagee, and he did preach once, as you mentioned, he preached that, quote, Hitler was a hunter sent by God to drive the Jews, quote unquote, back to Israel, as he put it. And so, this is openly anti-Semitic theology. And yet he was invited by the US government, by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to open the new US embassy in Jerusalem in 2018. Wow. And he was praying over it and all this kinds of stuff. And he's a close friend of Netanyahu. Netanyahu goes to Kufi events and conferences and speaks, video talks and stuff. And so Israel and Zionists have never really had a problem with actual anti-Semitism, with real Jew hatred. They only have a problem with Palestinian rights, with equal rights for Palestinians, and with smearing the equality for Palestinians as anti-Semitic, which is really dishonest and dangerous to the real fight against anti-Semitism.
Yeah, in the US, there's another organization called Canary Mission. So once in a while, they put like pictures of actual anti-Semites, but for the most part, it's just smearing, like starting harassment campaigns against students who advocate for Palestine.
Yeah, that's right. And I mentioned in the book there was this organization called the Israel on Campus Coalition, who they seem to have had some sort of involvement with Canary Mission. Canary Mission is this anonymous smearing website, which basically tries to make it harder for Palestinians in the US and Palestinian rights activists from getting students, mostly, from getting good jobs in the future by smearing them as anti-Semitic. And it came out in a documentary that was an undercover documentary that was filmed by Al Jazeera, although it was never released by them. We obtained a copy and posted it online. There was a really interesting quote that came out of that undercover investigation, whereby this pro-Israel organization admitted in undercover filming to being closely aligned with the Israeli government. They said that they, quote, coordinate their activities and they pass on, quote, intelligence to the Israeli government. And they described this anti-Semitism smearing as, quote, psychological warfare. It drives them crazy. Wow. So they said that the Palestinian students have to then, quote, either shut down or they spend time responding to it and investigating it. That's incredibly effective. So they know it's a smear. They know it's dishonest. They know it's untrue, but they don't care because to them it's a useful so-called psychological warfare campaign, you know. And they talk in this language of sort of counterinsurgency, which it tells you a lot about the imperialist politics of these people.
Yeah, and on both sides of the Atlantic, you kind of briefly mention it in your book, the BDS movement, which is boycott, divest, sanctions, have been, like, even advocating for it has gotten both legal consequences and also political campaigns, smear campaigns against it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the BDS movement advocates for equal rights for Palestinians all across historic Palestine, so including the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It advocates for the end of the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip by Israeli military forces, and it advocates for the return of the right to return of Palestinian refugees who were expelled from the country in 1948 and have been denied their legal right under international law to return to their homes and their ancestral homelands.
Yeah, well, people who are of Jewish ancestry who are, say, born in New York City, who's never have any connection, can go get Israeli citizenship as long as they are not too vociferous against Palestinian rights.
That's right. Yeah, anyone with a Jewish grandmother can instantly become a citizen of the state of Israel. That's the law of Israel. And yet Palestinians have no right to live in their own land. You know, they're tolerated at best, and increasingly they're not tolerated. And so the BDS movement is an international campaign led by Palestinians, which aims to foster boycotts from companies, from Israeli companies and companies complicit in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and to divest from such companies. And ultimately, hopefully, the aim is to get governments to start sanctioning them in some way.
Kind of like similar to, I guess, apartheid South Africa.
Exactly. It's very self-consciously, and it is explicitly modeled on the popular citizens' boycott of apartheid South Africa, which did have a large amount of success. And the BDS movement has a large amount of success. But what the BDS movement has faced is a massive smear campaign by pro-Israel groups and individuals, by the Israel lobby as a whole, saying that it's anti-Semitic and it's motivated by prejudice against Jews, you know, completely without any kind of basis to this. And so, yeah, and you know, because of Israeli lobbying and pro-Israeli lobbying in America, especially, there has been laws passed there's been many states that have tried to outlaw the BDS movement in some or at least to make it harder to do, I think those laws are ultimately going to run into problems because they're really contrary to the First Amendment, to the right to free speech, and some of them are, in the process of being struck down. But yeah, the BDS movement has faced this smear campaign of anti-Semitism, and it's a problem for the Palestine Solidarity movement all over the world.
Okay. I don't know how much more time we have left, but can you talk about what is next up for you and how people can find your amazing book?
Yeah, thanks. So I mentioned my latest article is on the Electronic Intifada, electronicintifada.net, and it's about how, and it's co-written with Kate Clarenberg, who you mentioned earlier, and it's about how a British intelligence cutout called Adam Smith International, the leaked files from them show that how closely they work with British spies and how those British spies have infiltrated the Palestinian Authority, and they work closely with Israeli occupation forces. So people can go and check out that. It's a really interesting piece. And I repost all my work on my Substack newsletter, where I also have original articles, and I post all my sort of podcast appearances like this one. So that's, people can go there and they can also support me financially as well if they want to, which I always appreciate. And so you can go there to asawinstanley.substack.com. And my book is out now in all good bookshops, and the best place to get it is from the publisher directly, which is orbooks.com.
Okay. And you also mentioned that you're working on the second book, like a sequel to this?
Well, not as such. I mean, I've made a few notes, but potentially, if the book is successful enough, there could be one. The story just doesn't end. So, yeah, it could happen.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming to this interview, and we really appreciate it. And please do keep in touch, because I really enjoy all your work, and I'm very I feel it's very informative. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Esha. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me.
Have a good rest of the afternoon.
You too. All right.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Hello, everyone. I was definitely not spending the whole break trying to figure out how to properly wear the ski job. Actually, I was.
Yes, you are. Is Matt coming back, or?
No, he can't because he's having internet problems.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna bring up Artsy Marxist right now.
Okay.
So,
are you? Hey, Artsy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your work before we begin?
Oh, well, she's not in the picture. If I do.
No, just put one of us in the small.
Okay. So you wanted me to talk a little bit about my work?
Yeah, and where people can find it. No, don't put her in the small. Put me in the small.
I'm putting me in the small.
Okay.
I'm in the small.
Okay.
It's me.
So,
go ahead, Artsy.
Basically, I am acrylics and oils painter. I also do some digital work. You can find me on Twitch at artsy_Marxist, or on Twitter. I've got a few different profiles now that Twitter randomly gave me a couple accounts back, but the main one I use is at Artsy Marxist with a 1 replacing the I. So it's ARTSYMARX1ST.
Yeah, I was running out of ways. Like, all these ones were coming up, and I was like, all right, which one am I tagging her in?
Yep. So it's a little complicated, but it's all on my Twitch as well. So yeah, and this one that I'm working on, it's a acrylic piece that I started last Friday. I had actually intended to do an oil painting of Lenin and found out all my linseed oil spilled. So I had to switch gears super fast, and I was like, you know what? I love landscapes. I'm just going to go for it. So Lenin ended up getting done on Sunday instead of Friday.
Okay.
But I still have, a little bit of detail and a tree in the foreground to add to this piece. So So yeah, I'm just gonna work on that.
Well, do you have any other Lenin pieces? And for anyone, my birthday is coming up in February.
Well, I
and
mean,
Christmas
this
is coming up
one-
soon.
Here, let me show it to you because this one is in progress. And I think you're gonna like it, Esha.
Okay, this is a not very subtle hint. Christmas is December 21st. Russian Christmas is January 6th. My birthday's in February.
Oh,
right. I'm gonna.
It might be a little tough to see.
Oh, this
hold
is
on.
beautiful.
I'm gonna do this.
There we go.
Oh, I love that.
I love that. This is like him walking down the Finland Bay here in Leningrad in a winter night like today. I can totally imagine him doing it, and he's probably done it thousands of times.
Yep, and I'm going to be adding a little more detail to this oil painting, but yeah, if anyone wants to get this for Esha, just contact me on Twitter because it's definitely available.
Yeah, like I said, holiday season, birthday. Lenin's birthday is April 22nd, whatever occasion.
Yeah, and we're gonna so for the next interview with who's it with?
Mitchell Plitnik and Dr. Sahar Aziz. In this interview we talk a lot more about the weaponizing of the anti-Semitism and all the organizations involved, and we go deeper. And it's a little less about Corbyn.
Yeah.
But Asa's thing is that if they can defeat a prime minister in England, there's extraordinary amounts of money being spent and an extraordinary amount of power. So I highly recommend everyone read his book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism. And so we kind of followed his book. Here, it was a little bit of a different situation. I got introduced to the Center for Security and Race Policy by another friend, Colin. And so we go through a specific report, and we talk about what happens to people who advocate for Palestine, and the way it's more technical in that there's an inherent assumption of criminalization for Arabs, etc., etc. And so this is going to be more intensely focused on the Israeli propaganda side.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So we're going to play, it's just an audio for that. So Artsy's going to be doing her thing. And
so this way you're visually entertained while you're listening to audio.
And Esha and I will be off camera, so you'll be seeing us. So
definitely not obsessing. I'm definitely not going to be obsessing about this anymore.
You just did for an hour and a half, so you don't need to obsess about it anymore. But there was a couple of things in the Asa that someone had brought up a comment here saying that it just it did it kind of reminded them. And I remember going through when I was first going through the interview, and he's talking about the organization in England. And I'm like, oh, that sounds a lot like the ADL. That sounds a lot like the ADL. And then all of a sudden he brings it up and I'm like, okay.
Well, somebody in the comment section on YouTube called it the Arab Defamation League. I agree.
Yes, I saw that too. That was up here. But it was really good. And then I mentioned this to Esha before when they were talking about Ed Milner, is it?
Ed Miliband.
Miliband and his father. I was like, that just reminds me of Buttigieg because his father was a Marxist. So yeah. So there is a lot of parallels. So
there's a lot of parallels. I mean, they're two brothers.
Yeah. So. Anything else you want to add, Esha, or you want to?
Oh, I sent you a tweet over WeChat that kind of responds to John Podhart's. I don't know how to pronounce his name. His tweet.
Okay.
We can show this after.
Yeah, let's show it after because I don't have it. I only have it on my phone right now because I don't have
no worries. So with this, enjoy the interview. Be sure to hit like, subscribe, and also super chats are appreciated a lot. Today we have two wonderful faculty members from Rutgers here to talk to us about weaponizing anti-Semitism on this side of the Atlantic. You've already heard about what happened to Corbyn from Asa Winstanley. So now, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Mitchell Plitnik. I'm the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy. I'm not actually a Rutgers faculty member.
Sorry.
Maybe someday. But I am formerly the vice president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Before that, the director of the U.S. Office of B'Tselem. And before that, the co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. Also wrote with Mark Lamont Hill the book, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics.
So my name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a distinguished professor of law at Rutgers University Law School. I'm also the executive director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the only civil rights center at an American law school that focuses on the human and civil rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. And I am the author of The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, which explains why in a country that privileges religious freedom, Muslims are excluded from that right normatively and politically, and in some contexts also legally.
Yeah, I mean, ever since 9/11, I've noticed that it's 100,000 times worse. I was probably too young before 9/11, but I do remember like how I'm Indian and things changed for us so rapidly and so much for the worse. And I'm sure for Muslims, it must have been much, much more hellish transition.
Oh yeah, the book pretty much lays it out. It's a result of 20 years of advocacy, research, writing, and teaching on the subject. So I hope that it serves as a resource for people to understand just how entrenched Islamophobia has become, unfortunately, in the United States.
Yes, and I would love to have you on again after I read that beer book too. Right now, since October 7th, there's, I guess, I don't want to call it a war because maybe war is not the right word, but there are events going on in Gaza, and commensurate with proportional to these events, it's kind of related to the theme of your report that I read about how there's a presumption of guilt for people who advocate on the behalf of Palestinians or Palestine. Do you want to begin with talking a little bit about that? And when you said that, it hit me. I was like, yes, there is a presumption of guilt that they have to kind of, in any media circuit, any place, they have to kind of overcome that, which is like
Well, let me start with the broader context of Islamophobia, which is that definitely since 9/11 and to a lesser extent before 9/11, Muslims have become racialized. And anyone who is perceived to be Muslim have been racialized. That includes Arab Christians, Indian Hindus, South Asians, anyone who looks like the caricature of a Muslim on the news, and that caricature is often portrayed only in the context of terrorism. So Muslims are presumed to be violent, they're presumed to support terrorism, they're presumed to be misogynistic, to be illiberal, anti-democratic, anti-American, and they're also presumed to hate Jews. And so all of these various stereotypes are bundled in this adverse racialization process that has very serious material and psychological and legal consequences on this diverse group of people that, again, are homogenized as the racial Muslim. And those consequences include discrimination in the workplace, in schools, in public spaces. It includes hate crimes, as we sadly just saw with the 3 Palestinian young men who were shot in Burlington, Vermont, because they were wearing keffiyehs and speaking Arabic. It also manifests itself in the government targeting Muslims in national security policies, immigration, and other forms of enforcement that selectively targets Muslims. And finally, it also manifests itself by silencing and censoring Muslims and Arabs when they seek to defend the human rights of Palestinians. or Arabs or Muslims abroad, but particularly Palestinians because of what Mitchell has written in his other excellent work, is that you have many organizations and members of the elite and elected officials and people in the media who have a political agenda of silencing any support or humanization of Palestinians and controlling the narrative that produces an unconditional support of Israel without holding it accountable for any human rights violations. And so this Islamophobia and this right-wing Zionism merges together to then kind of doubly harm Muslims or those who are presumed to be Muslims and Arabs who defend the rights of Palestinians. And we're seeing that on full display right now through this tragic siege on Gaza, where students and professors and even employees are being fired, they're being censored, they're being expelled, they're being academically disciplined simply for defending the human rights of Palestinians and bringing the perspective of Palestinians in Gaza who are being starved, dehydrated, indiscriminately bombed, and denied medical access, medical care, because the hospitals are being intentionally destroyed by the Israeli military.
But before we talk more about Gaza, I do want to bring up a very good point highlight a very good point you brought up about how such a big lobby on behalf of Israel aren't even Jews, but it's the fundamentalist Christians. The Pastor Hagee, he's the one who has Christians for United PAC, right?
Christians United for Israel. Yeah. So and I think that this kind of takes off on what Sahar was just saying. When we look at and want to answer the question of why is it so easy for the United States to support what Israel's doing right now in Gaza? Why is it so easy for Joe Biden to just disregard the words of Palestinians and take at face value the words of Israelis who have lied to him in the past? Why does that happen? Well, it doesn't just happen systemically. It doesn't just come up. There's an intentional effort out there to demonize Palestinians through Islamophobia, through anti-Arab racism. This is a big part of what we document in this report, is the groups that are actively. It's not just that there's Islamophobia in the air and it sort of wafts its way into policy. There are groups and people who are active and supporting the idea that Palestinians in particular, but Muslims in general, are inherently anti-Semitic, and they will of course argue, "Oh, not every Muslim," and they'll mean that, but and this is why we named the report as we did. The presumption is that a Muslim is anti-Semitic until proven otherwise, and that is out there in both an atmospheric way, where we live in a society where Muslims are demonized. Most Muslims in the world, certainly in the United States, are people of color. So we have the racial aspect already there that Sahar so brilliantly demonstrates in her book, how it gets woven into this prejudicial view of Muslims in every regard. But when it comes to Israel, this is an important sort of other side of the coin, right? There is an attachment. We talk about Joe Biden will talk about the unbreakable relationship and the passionate attachment to Israel. But there's the other side of that. The other side is that if you're going to be that attached to Israel, you have to, by definition, almost make sure that you are turning the Palestinians into evil, so that any move towards Palestinian liberation, any criticism of Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, even if the groups in question are saying, well, you can criticize Israel to a point. They'll say that in the abstract, but in reality, any criticism of Israel is deemed as anti-Semitic, and doubly so if it comes from a Muslim, and then triply so if it comes from a Palestinian. It is not, and we actually hear this. I mean, it's stated explicitly by many supporters of Israel. We hear them say Palestinians are not interested in their own freedom. They're not interested in a better future for their children. All they want to do is kill Jews. Sometimes they say that's Hamas. Sometimes they say it's all Palestinians. But I mean, that is that when you talk about that, that is an inherent dehumanization, and it's not unfamiliar. And I think this is what's one of the things that Americans have forgotten. Look back at our own history. We said the same thing about indigenous people here. We said the same things about indigenous people in Latin America. We said the same things about indigenous people in Canada and Australia and in Africa and everywhere else that Europeans have colonized. We have said they're just savages. They just want to kill us while we're just trying to be really nice to them by taking their lands and everything that they have. So this echo of that sort of colonialism also touches a nerve, I think, for Americans and makes them even more reactionary, more susceptible to hearing that, yes, this is really just about Palestinians hating Jews. There's one other aspect that I think, we spend a lot of time on in the report that I think is really important. And that is the fact that when we're talking about how are we going to change U.S. policy, how are we going to change American attitudes, the most powerful way to do that is by Muslims and Jews working together. And by telling the world that Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic. So I as a Jew have a Muslim friend. That Muslim is just hiding their anti-Semitism until such time as it will come out. That is the method of trying to split the Jewish and Muslim communities and blunt that potential power. And we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it in the organization of protests against Gaza. These are Muslim, everywhere you go, you look at these protests, they are Muslims and Jews working together. And that's what has had an impact. And people, whether or not people in Washington are seeing it yet, their voters are.
Well, okay, so I kind of want to come back to one of the earlier points you made, because you made a lot of points. The first point is the systematic dehumanization that happens all over. About a year ago, I interviewed these two researchers who researched how basically Hollywood does a lot of national security propaganda. And one film that really shocked me was called Rules of Engagement, where this man goes and shoots everyone in the village. But at the end of the movie, you were like, the movie is like, it's a village full of Muslims, of course. And at the end, you realize that everyone in the village is conspiring to tell a lie to get this American guy in trouble. When reality is he probably, that was one of the most shocking movies I've ever heard about. And then I saw it, and that level of racism is just beyond that. And that's just not one example. But so we see that in Hollywood, TV, news media. The second comment you made about is about the presumption of anti-Semitism and how Jews and Muslims working together is the best way to combat it. And I think that is that has been very effective, especially with the big protest in Grand Central Station with the Jewish Voices for Peace. But yeah, and another thing is that whenever they ask a question about Israel or Palestine, there's always a point where they don't go before that point or after that point. There's always this big set of unstated assumptions they want you to make. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I want to comment a little bit about the Jewish-Muslim-Arab alliances, which are one of the positive outcomes from this tragic situation or siege, war crimes going on in Gaza that was in response to the war crimes of Hamas. So both parties are committing war crimes, but I think it's clear from the facts that Israel has exponentially outdone Hamas in terms of the level of killing and devastation.
Only one of them has an Air Force. I was in an interview with CBC a few weeks ago, and apparently an Israeli IDF spokesman had claimed that they had killed the head of the Hamas Air Force. And then the CBC person asked me, does Hamas have an airport? Does Gaza have an airport? I was like, nope.
It was destroyed in 2001, right? The Israelis destroyed it. But I think the positive, one of the positive outcomes is we are seeing more Jews that are either anti-Zionist or at least anti-political Zionism because there are different forms of Zionism, and I know Peter Beinart and perhaps Mitchell has also written about cultural Zionism and other forms that don't require this brutal occupation or complete control of the land that was historic Palestine exclusively by Jews. But what we're seeing now is the young Muslim and Arab and Palestinians and the young Jews that are all Americans working together in pursuit of common values, which is humanizing all people, right, and humanizing Palestinians in particular, and showing that AIPAC and the American Defamation League and the ADL and other Zionist groups do not represent all Jews. There's over 7 million Jews in America, and it's racist to assume that they all agree. And it's also racist to assume that only 2 or 3 organizations that may have the deepest pockets speak for them. And I think that is an important development we're seeing among young Jewish Americans, that many of us in the Muslim and Arab community are learning quite a bit from them about the diversity and heterogeneity within the Jewish American community, but also about the opportunities to work together. And that in itself is evidence that Muslims are not anti-Semitic, right? If you hate a particular group, you will not become friends with them. You will not ally with them politically. You will not hire them. You will not socialize and live with them. And if you look at the facts of the everyday average Muslim in America, we do not see systematic anti-Semitism. Well, the people who are engaging in what is I think uncontroversially anti-Semitic acts such as killing people at synagogues, physical harassment or physical assault and hate crimes, discrimination in various contexts, almost exclusively tend to be white nationalists. And when these Zionist organizations point to Muslims or Arabs or Palestinians in the United States alleging that they're committing anti-Semitism, it's really, if you dig deeper, what they're doing is they're criticizing the state of Israel, is they're criticizing the brutal occupation of Palestinians, is they're defending the human rights of Palestinians and international human rights. And in fact, it is not about a hatred for an entire people or hatred against a religion. It is expecting and demanding that the United States government, the United States people, and the international community treat Palestinians with the same level of humanity and dignity and rights as they do Jewish people or Israeli citizens. And so to even claim that that's anti-Semitic, and as we talk about in the report, is actually doubly harmful, both to Jewish communities who do experience anti-Semitism, but it is not that is not what I just described is not what anti-Semitism is. And it also hurts Muslims and Palestinians because then they are unable to be equal citizens and fully civically engaged in society. And they also experience backlash and discrimination, such as having offers from jobs be rescinded, such as being fired from their jobs, such as being doxxed and harassed. And in the tragic case of the 3 Palestinian young men in Vermont, shot with a gun by a white male.
Yeah, one thing I do want to point out is that the United States government, after World War II, saw the concentration camps, saw what the Nazis did, and still allowed hundreds of thousands of them in here. So they don't have the moral authority to talk about anybody else's anti-Semitism, especially after their conduct after World War II. But the second thing I noticed is that a lot of history is erased. For example, in order to make Israel fit in, they forget everything that happened before, like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Palestine Mandate, the Ottoman Empire, World War II, and so it seems like they want to erase everything that happened before that one day in 1947 or 8.
Israel's independence was declared in 1948.
1948,
so
yeah.
The war started in 1947.
So that's kind of that is what I notice. Do you notice that kind of actual effort to erase everything before that date and history?
I think there's always, when you're writing history, it was one of the first things I learned when I started studying history, is that the first question you're asking when you're writing a history is, where do you start the story? Where do you start? Because any history of any country, of any incident, you can trace it as far back as the beginning of time if you want to. So you have to make a decision as to where you start the story. I think this came up recently over the Gaza conflict, when the Secretary General of the United Nations said that the Hamas attack on October 7th did not happen in a vacuum, and everybody went ballistic. How could you say that? You're justifying the attack. Well, I mean, he's stating a simple fact, number one. Number two, this goes to the question you're asking in a more contemporary context. It undermined the narrative that Hamas, which committed a horrific act. This was clearly a war crime. It was not covered by the right to resist under international law. We're now seeing evidence of some pretty horrible behavior, including sexual assault and things like that. That was at first said and then questioned, but we're now seeing it from human rights organizations like Physicians for Human Rights just put out a report about this. So I think it is definitely gaining credibility, and we're seeing that yes, some of these incidents did happen. These are unquestionable crimes, but they did not happen in a vacuum. They didn't just and the narrative that says that they did is the same narrative that says Hamas is ISIS. Hamas is an organization that built its reputation with war crimes. With suicide bombings, that's how it came to prominence, almost 30 years ago. It is also a political organization. There are many organizations that we can talk about that have committed war crimes, many states, including very much the United States and Israel. In fact, those would be at the top of the list. So if we're, if we're delegitimizing everyone that committed war crimes, well, that is really where you start. But there's no defense for what Hamas did on October 7th. There's no excuse for it, but there is understanding it. And you can't understand it if you start the story on October 7th. The same way as you can't understand the Nakba, the catastrophe that befell Palestinians in the 47 to 49 war that resulted in the expulsion of some 2/3 or 3/4 of the population. You can't understand that if you start the story in 1948. You can't understand the power behind the Zionist movement if you don't include, first of all, World War II. You can't understand the difficulties that were created by the fact that the British held, basically held that whole territory under military occupation from the end of World War I until 1948. You can't understand the history if you don't understand that this was that the Zionist immigration that before the state was created came almost entirely from Europe, brought with it European ideas of the time, which included things like the white man's burden, that the Europeans actually came there thinking, well, we have to teach these backward Arabs how to build a society. And those were the people who were thinking they were trying to do good. That was the perspective, but it was clearly a racist perspective. And there were others, of course, who held a more explicitly racist perspective. So there's a lot that, of course, always needs to be understood. And you can't understand what's happening now if you start the story on October 7th. If you don't understand that Gaza's been under siege since 2005, if you don't understand that the occupation's been going on since 1967, that Palestinians have been living largely as refugees, especially in Gaza, the overwhelming majority have been refugees since 1948. You can't, and what those measures entail. So Professor Sahar Roy at Harvard has done.
The measure. Okay, so this is a hypothetical. There technically are not supposed to be settlers in Gaza, so let's use this hypothetical in the West Bank. Suppose I'm a Jewish settler in the West Bank, and I beat up a Palestinian woman. Where am I going to get tried?
If you're a Jewish settler in the West Bank, you will be tried by an Israeli civil court.
Okay.
And if you're a Palestinian who does the same crime to an Israeli woman, you'll be tried by an Israeli military court.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was kind of trying to get at with the differential rights.
Right.
And
which is why the claim that Israel is a democracy is not fully accurate. It's a democracy for Jewish citizens of Israel, It is a military occupation of Palestinians, and it is a quasi-democracy for the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are treated like second or third class citizens in terms of how the law does not apply equally to them. It's not enforced the same. And there are, in fact, laws that intentionally discriminate against anyone who is not Jewish.
Right.
Yep. And one example is, Mitchell, are you Jewish?
Yes.
Okay. So tomorrow
All
you
my
can
life.
go and decide to be Israeli, right?
I'm sorry. I
Tomorrow
can
you
go. I can go. They might look at my history and think twice, but no, technically yes, I can go to Israel right now and apply for citizenship under the law of return, and under existing Israeli law, they'd have to accept. They'd have to accept me. I don't think they'd be happy about it, but they'd have to accept me as a citizen because I'm Jewish. Yes.
And if my grandmother was if my grandmother lived in Haifa and my great grandfather and great great grandfather lived there, what happens to me?
I mean, there's no way you'll become a citizen. They depending on, if you have relatives in Haifa, they will probably allow you. They will allow a Palestinian American into Israel most of the time, assuming that person has not been active in, for example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, or they have other reason to bar them. But they will usually allow them into Israel for a visit. But you better not overstay your visa, because they will make sure that you don't do that. But becoming a citizen is out of the question. It's just it is just not possible.
Back to your report. You guys both detail this network that happens in college campuses. There's some after college that look innocuous at first. They have some generic name. And then you realize that they are often funded by the colleges or publicly funded, that are just there to spew out anti-Islamic hate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, these organizations, some of them predate 9/11, because what we call lawfare and rulefare has been going on at least since the early 90s.
Can you talk to me about lawfare? A little bit.
Yeah, lawfare is the phenomena of using legal mechanisms in order to pursue anti-democratic, racist, or other forms of authoritarian practices. So, for example, using litigation that is frivolous or is very weak on the merits to simply harass someone, make them have to hire a lawyer, make them distracted and drained in terms of resources, time, and stress, and to scare anybody else from engaging in that same behavior. And so lawsuits are intended for people to pursue their rights. They are not intended for people to harass other people. But unfortunately, because our legal system requires that every party pay for their own legal fees, and because the bar for being censored or punished for abusing litigation in order to harass others, that bar is really high, so it's very hard to prove. Therefore, you have many organizations that just use lawsuits to harass and to drain. And they also use rules within universities, academic disciplining rules, to put students under investigation, even if at the end of the investigation, the student is found not to have violated any rules, their reputation has been smeared. Many in the Zionist media, in blogs and other forms of media outlets that tailor to right-wing Zionist audiences will do hit stories on the students and try to ruin their future careers. These organizations will file administrative complaints with the Department of Education, which drains the Department of Education's resources. It causes universities to have to pay their own legal fees. It causes bad publicity. And again, oftentimes at the end of all of that, there is no wrongdoing that's found. We saw this with Rutgers University, which had a DOE complaint filed against it I think it was around 2011 or 2010 when Obama was in office. And after a very long, protracted investigation, the Department of Education found that Rutgers had not violated any civil rights laws. However, what happened, which is what they wanted in the end, is it quashed and chilled all activism or discussion or even programming related to Palestine at Rutgers University. So that's what lawfare is. It was filing litigation not because your rights have in fact been violated, but really to as a political weapon, right? To quash, silence, and punish the people that you believe, well, that are your political opposition as far as you're concerned. And there are racial dimensions to that because the Zionist organizations tend to intentionally target Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian groups. And the reason why it's so easy to do is because American society has already been socialized to distrust Muslims, to suspect Muslims, to dehumanize them. And after 9/11, that was permanently entrenched. So you need both the perpetrator to abuse the law, and you need a target that is already dehumanized within the broader public. So to give you a counterexample, after the January 6, 2021 insurrection, which was a historic criminal anti-democratic act, right, where you had a group of white nationalists, a mob of white nationalists, predominantly males, who went and attacked the U.S. Capitol and tried to reverse a presidential election in the United States. This is unprecedented. Because they were white and because they were Christian, you did not see the United States government, the law enforcement, the FBI go on a rampage to arrest and surveil and attack or prosecute whites who were on the political right. They didn't go and tell the churches that preach right-wing conservative political values, you need to stop doing that or we're going to arrest you, we're going to surveil you. They effectively said, no, this is just an individual group of people, we're going to prosecute them as individuals, and we will not presume that all white people, all political conservatives are, or all Republicans or all Trump supporters are in fact terrorists or criminals. That's the privilege of whiteness. That's the privilege of Christian identity. But if you had kept all the facts exactly the same, but switched out black people, we all know that the government and the public would have responded very differently, or if they had all been Muslim people. So that's effectively what lawfare is.
Like in Washington, when people were protesting for George Floyd's death, protesting on behalf of George Floyd's death, Tom Cotton actually wrote an editorial about like bringing out the Insurrection Act from 100 years ago. Yeah.
And he called them, and the government called them black identity extremists.
Oh, did they? Okay, I did not know about that. That sounds.
It was a special category in the FBI in order to effectively criminalize the political movement that aimed to stop police excessive force historically produced, and to, again, demand that African Americans are treated with equality and dignity and as first-class citizens just like white people.
Well, from my end here in Michigan, I noticed there was a case in Missouri, or maybe Florida, I can't remember, but they were exclusively black people, and they said that Ukraine is a Nazi state and the U.S. is a racist state. And they actually got prosecuted by the DOJ for being secretly funded by Russia when they said like two of the most like banal things about both of these states.
Well, that's how prosecutorial discretion can be used to further all forms of bias. And that's one of the reasons why we argue in our report. It's really important. One of the recommendations we have is that the U.S. government include experts on Palestine who are experts on the majority Muslim countries in the Middle East and South Asia and Central Asia, because what we saw after 9/11 was a type of groupthink that was a threat to our national security. People didn't know Arabic in the State Department. They didn't, or in the FBI, they didn't. There was only one FBI agent who was fluent in Arabic. People had not studied in the region. They hadn't lived in the region. And they were making all sorts of rookie mistakes that cost the United States billions of dollars, and it cost Iraqis and Afghanis their lives. And also completely shattered, if there had ever been any positive reputation of the United States in the Middle East, it was completely gone after 9/11, which in itself is not in the best interest of the United States. There's only so much you can do if the only relationship you have with a region is through its authoritarian leaders that you prop up, whereas the entire population hates you and is looking for any opportunity to kick you out of the region and to completely exclude you from the region. And this is a bit beyond our scope, but as China rises, I think the United States is going to see the consequence of that, because more and more people in the Middle East are going to feel that, well, we don't want the U.S. involved. All they've done is caused us death and misery and supported our dictatorships, and maybe China might do better. We don't know, but at least we're willing to consider it.
I think also, but looking back at that era and one of the things that came out that I just found at that time, I found so shocking, was that the State Department actually rotates people out of regions, particularly with a particular focus on the Middle East, would rotate them out after a couple of years so that they do not, as the saying goes, go native. The idea was that they did not want their diplomatic staff to become too sympathetic to the local population. They wanted to see them as outside and be able to, theoretically be able to form policy without having attachments. But of course, that all they're doing is reinforcing one, bias towards one side. They did see at that time the foolishness of that when the Twin Towers were destroyed. They figured out maybe that was not the best strategy, but they're kind of doing it again right now. We're seeing this, the Biden administration, and particularly Joe Biden himself, has decided that the policy towards Israel and Gaza is going to be entirely driven by him. There are very few voices that he is listening to. He is absolutely ignoring, as is the Secretary of State, the State Department staff, which are the people who are actually trained in the Middle East. I mean, I know a number of people at the State Department who are quite expert in the entire region and are specialists in Israel-Palestine. We saw this when the Oslo process finally died, which I date to about 10 years ago in 2013. One of the things that happened was that the Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, after Obama had kind of said, okay, I'm going to put my energies elsewhere, he said, well, let me take one more crack at this and let me try. And I think he made what was a sincere effort, but he clearly did not understand very basic things about the Palestinians. So one of the main issues at the time was, and it's being echoed again now, it was this demand by Israel that the Palestinians accept Israel as a Jewish state, recognize it as a Jewish state, which is
like recognizing America as a white state.
Exactly. It is completely outside the boundaries of normal.
As South Africans to recognize South Africa as a white state.
Exactly. And
more specifically, a white Christian state.
Right. A white Christian state. Okay.
It's an unprecedented demand. No nation, nations in international diplomacy, states recognize other states. We do not, for example, we recognize Iran as a state, even though we may not get along with them. But we recognize Iran as a state. We do not recognize the Islamic Republic of Iran, nor has Iran ever demanded that we do. Okay, we do not recognize the People's Republic of China. We recognize China's sovereignty, and the nature of that government is their own. Kerry could not understand why this was such a big deal to the Palestinians, demands, because not only was it an unusual and unprecedented demand, and he understood that part, but what he didn't understand was that basically what this demand means is that the Palestinians must accept the legitimacy of Zionism and its dispossession of the Palestinians. That's what that means if you accept Israel as a Jewish state. The Palestinians have been willing to say, this is what happened. We were dispossessed. We're willing to move on from here and figure out some way to move forward. But they're not going to say it was okay for you to do this to us. That is unreasonable on every level. And Kerry just could not understand how basic this was to the Palestinian national identity and how offensive it was, how impossible it was for the Palestinians to do it. And I actually think he was one of the rare examples of a well-intentioned American diplomat who really was trying to push the process forward, naively, I think, but he literally had no real familiarity. He knew the members of the Palestinian Authority. He'd known them for years, but he did not understand Palestine. He was not versed in it. That was just not what he was trained in. And he was just ignorant of why this was such a big deal. He legitimately could not understand it. This is all comes out of this almost, this mix of accidental ignorance, which, comes from the United States' own emphasis on, or lack of emphasis on education in general, and specifically on education about the rest of the world, but also a willful ignorance built by, again, this Islamophobic network that is there to demonize and otherize and dehumanize Palestinians especially, but Muslims in general. We're seeing it all over. Again, now we are talking, and we talk a lot about the twin problems now. At least those of us in the progressive camp talk about the twin problems of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and how we have to fight both to defeat either. We talk about that, and yet in the mainstream press there is a lot more coverage of anti-Semitism, which there should be. The level of coverage of anti-Semitism, in my view, is appropriate, but it obscures the fact that Jews have not been shot. Thankfully, Jews have not been shot since the beginning of this latest flare up in Gaza. Of course, there was the Tree of Life synagogue a few years back that was horrific, and it was very traumatic for all of us. But in recent weeks, we do not have Jews being shot. We do not have them being run over by cars. We do not, we do have incidents of Jews being punched. We have incidents of Jews being physically harassed and intimidated, and those are terrible. Those should not happen, and we should be bringing attention to that. But but we don't pay as much attention to 3 Palestinian students shot in Vermont. We don't pay as much attention to an Arab student run over by a car at Stanford University. And we've already forgotten about the Palestinian child who was killed in Illinois. That's just gone from the news. So, yeah.
I think the other thing that's important is that we have to differentiate between who the perpetrators are and what their political motivation is. And oftentimes it is when Jews are victims of genuine anti-Semitism, especially in the form of violence or harassment, oftentimes it is by white nationalists. And
for when Muslims
right,
are.
and if they are victims of an Arab or a Palestinian who commits anti-Semitism and violates the law, instead of the media and the public and the government treating this anti-Semitic act as the act of a bad actor, of an individual, which it would be, they then say, see, we told you all Arabs hate Jews. We told you all Muslims hate Jews. Whereas when the white nationalists commit it, they don't conclude, oh, well, all white people hate Jews and all Christians hate Jews and all Americans hate Jews. And so we also need to be consistent and accurate in how we respond to these forms of hatred and recognize that oftentimes the people who are committing genuine anti-Semitic acts and genuine Islamophobic acts tend to be the same groups of people who are opposed to any challenge to white supremacy, any challenge to white dominance or Christian dominance. And this is another kind of tragic consequence of the polarization that's resulting from the Israel's war crimes in Gaza, is that the Jewish community is not realizing that you should be allying with the Muslim community and with the Black community and with other minorities, because oftentimes those who are racist against various minorities have the same ideology. And again, distinguishing between, okay, you and I may disagree about the politics of Palestine, the politics of Israel, the solution to how to provide self-determination to both Palestinians and Jews, but that doesn't mean that we hate each other. That doesn't mean that we hate each other's religion or religious identity. But that is effectively the false choice that Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians are faced with in the United States. And that is really what the report is trying to debunk, so that we can start having meaningful and informed conversations rather than just smear each other with false accusations of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia.
And I am very surprised at the size of the Christian Zionist movement, whose entire, it's actually very confusing, but they want to create a biblical state for some kind of prophecy in the Bible to come, and they're much larger than we think, actually.
They're actually, in terms of numbers, they're much bigger than, they're bigger than the entire Jewish community.
Wow.
Just by there's only 7 million Jews in the United States. It's not, out of this population, that's a very tiny number. So, and this is obviously a Christian country, but more than that, this is, there's a certain amount of kind of diversity in that Christian Zionist.
So we have
mob.
Our Mike Pompeo's, and then
so there are. Yeah, we have people. We've had a number of people. Mike Pompeo is only one example of people who adhere to that ideology in our government. But more important is the massive lobbying that they can do, and they have. This is, for example, this issue is completely bought by the Christian Zionists in the Republican Party. There's no dissent in the Republican Party. There's no disagreement. Occasionally, there's a Republican who's a little bit more libertarian and questions about things like military aid to Israel. But in terms of pure support for Israel's actions, there's no disagreement in the entire party, which, on the ground is actually not true. When you look at the polls, you do see Republicans, not in huge numbers, maybe 25, 35, maybe 40% on a given issue might disagree with Israel. But it's certainly not this 100% lockup. So the Christian Zionists basically have one of the two parties completely locked down, and so the rest of the lobbying effort, which includes them as well, goes over to the Democrats. And this is a lot of what Mark Lamont Hill and I talked about in our book. That the massive influence on the Democratic Party makes them, on this issue, makes the Democrats look very, very right wing. And in many ways, almost indistinguishable from the Republican. The only real difference is that there's at least a handful of members of Congress who debate these issues. Yes, Christian Zionism is a very powerful motivating force. It is extremely Islamophobic. It is, for the most part, extremely anti-Semitic. The ideological core is anti-Semitic, even though over the past, I would say, 15 years or so, there has been a concerted effort to bury that. There's been a concerted effort to publicly make that, say, no, we love the Jews. All we want to do is make sure the Jews are okay.
Right at this moment, just for our audience, where he says that something like God sent Hitler over or something like that.
So that was John Hagee. That was how he lost the support of, at the time, Republican presidential, or his endorsement was refused by the Republican presidential nominee at the time, John McCain, because he said that Hitler was sent by God to punish the Jews for turning our backs on Israel and on Jerusalem, and to push the Jewish community towards Israel in order to bring on Armageddon and all of this ridiculous nonsense, which of course means that the idea is not only was God punishing the Jews with the Holocaust, but he was sending them to Israel for another Holocaust, so that the rest of us could be wiped out. This is the man that is brought up now to speak at a major pro-Israel rally, which I think, and I think this is an incredibly crucial point. No, I'm sorry.
It was a rally with, say, Chuck Schumer, Van Jones. It was a diverse cast of people in the rally, like of all.
Yeah, and when Van Jones just suggested the mere idea of a ceasefire, he was shouted down by the crowd. I mean, this is, and I have argued with many people and said that it was perfectly appropriate for John Hagee, who is anti-Semitic and Islamophobic, to have been at that rally. That's where he belongs, at a pro-war rally where Jews and Muslims and Christians as well will be killing each other. That's what he wants. That's where he should be. It was Van Jones. And people like him, ostensible liberals who had no business being there and should not have been there, no matter what they said. And the fact that then they said, well, we objected to John Hagee being there. But again, this was John Hagee's place. This is where they belong. People like him are exactly at the pro-war core, and it is the liberals that's why it's the liberals that are the real problem. The liberals are the ones who are not sticking to their own values, and that was why Mark and I wrote this book. That was why Sahar and I are mapping out what are these forces that are pushing people who are liberal on so many issues to be absolutely racist and hateful and promoting literal killing of Palestinians. How does that work? How does that happen? And it happens because this Islamophobic narrative is pushed to such a huge degree that you can actually look at what Hamas did, which is terrible. It is terrible, but do we look at our own actions in My Lai? Do we look at our own actions at Abu Ghraib, or let alone Fallujah, and so many, everything that we did in Afghanistan? Do we look at those, which are just as horrific as what Hamas did? All of the crimes that Hamas committed, we committed in some places, our soldiers committed in places too. We somehow, though, for Hamas, this means that it is now okay to kill what is, as at the time we're speaking now, over 15,000 Palestinians in Gaza in just a month and a half. I mean, how do liberals back that? How do they support it? How does that happen? And I think our report goes a long way to answering that question.
I have one question though. So I've met with many congressional candidates. Many of them are like, "Oh, I totally agree with you on Israel and Palestine, but this position is untenable." How much of it is BS and how much of it is true?
Can I just hold on? I just want to add to what Mitchell was saying is there are multiple reasons why the Christian Zionists are Zionists. And one of them is what he explained is theologically driven, although perversely anti-Semitic, right? Because they believe that the Jews have to go back to Israel so that the Jews can all be killed. And then the Christians can dominate and all go to heaven. But the other additional factor is their hatred for Muslims, right? And the clash of civilizations narrative that became permanent after 9/11, but had been percolating among the Christian right before 9/11 and was part of Orientalism. But my point is that it's doubly more difficult to disabuse Christian Zionism of the harms and the racism behind their support for Zionism, because it's not just the anti-Semitism that drives it, right? It's very utilitarian, but it's also the Islamophobia that drives it. And it's very unfortunate, and I keep wanting to be wrong when I make this statement, but Muslims or anti-Muslim racism and anti-Muslim prejudice is the only form of racism that is acceptable and mainstreamed.
Did you see the Washington Post cartoon from a few weeks ago that they retracted?
Right. Exactly. If you engage in overt anti-Black racism, you will be shunned, you will be stigmatized, and you will possibly face, other forms of adverse consequences, as you should. If you engage in openly anti-Semitism or open anti-Semitism, you'll be stigmatized, you'll be marginalized, you'll experience all forms of legal consequences. And we can kind of go down the line. But when it comes to expressing bias or prejudice or racism against Muslims, it's framed as, well, that's just rational exercise of critical thinking, that is patriotic, pro-national security positions, that is simply a political position. And again, if we want to take a very expansionist, purist approach to political speech, fine, but we must be consistent. And we need to decide what kind of society we want. And at the very least, like, I don't believe that people should be legally penalized for engaging in hateful speech. But I do think that there should be social consequences, right? There should be kind of a consequence. They're not necessarily within a court of law or that are imposed by a government, but at least among social groups where we have minimum standards of civility, and that we state, if you are going to hold such hateful beliefs or express such hateful statements, we don't accept that, and we're going to tell you, shame on you. But nobody does that when it comes to bias and prejudice against Muslims, and we've seen that over and over and over again. My book talks extensively about it, but I had really hoped when I finished the book that it was the closure of an era, and that we were going to start at least moving on to a next phase where Americans had realized, based on Trump's overt Islamophobia, his Muslim ban, so many examples of just rabid Islamophobia, that Americans had turned a page and said, okay, we need to stop this. But what we're seeing now during the siege on Gaza by Israel is that it's actually much worse than we expected, especially when the face of Islamophobia.
What Netanyahu said, and this is really important, what Netanyahu said in referring to Amalek. So Amalek in the Bible was a nation that attacked the children of Israel from behind while they were wandering in the desert, trying to wipe them out. The commandment from God was that Amalek, as a result of that, must be completely wiped from the memory of the earth. The men, the women, the children, the animals, the slaves, everybody who were in any way associated with Amalek had to be wiped out. There is occasionally over the centuries, there have been debates among scholars about whether Amalek even exists anymore, if there's any descendants left, et cetera. And for the most part, it's been dismissed as a relic of the past. But it gets built up. Sometimes, and it's been, Netanyahu was not the first one to cite this in the context of the Palestinians. He is the first prime minister to do so, as far as I know, in the context of the Palestinians. And the key thing about that is that, as I described, what is the Jewish commandment when it comes to Amalek? When you're talking about Amalek as a Jew, you're not just pulling it out as somebody who is, if you're Hindu and haven't read the Torah and don't know exactly what Amalek stands for. As a Jew, you're saying the Palestinians must be wiped out. This is very unusual in terms of, this is where it's a political statement, because it gives the world something that we rarely get in cases like this, which is actual proof of intent of genocide. When you charge genocide is a word that's thrown around. It's true, pro-Israel people are saying this all the time. Well, the term is thrown around way too often, this and that, and that's actually true. People, when there's large numbers of civilians killed, people think that's genocide, but there's a legal definition that goes beyond a large number of people of a certain group being killed.
To wipe out a population.
The intent to wipe out a people as a people. That's what Netanyahu said they were doing. Those are his words. He actually said that, which is really rare. Usually people committing genocide don't say, hey, I'm committing genocide. And that's not the only statement. You also have Yoav Gallant saying that we're fighting, human animals and we're going to fight them as such. You have the spokesperson of the IDF saying we are not going for precision, we're going for maximum damage. These are all genocidal statements, and they're it is unusual to have it so openly proclaimed. The problem is not just, and I agree with Sahar that I would like to see mainstream Jewish organizations screaming about this. Like, you don't say that. Even the pro-Israel ones should be doing that. But I think the bigger problem is the person who really should be screaming about it is Joe Biden. And not only has Joe Biden not objected to it, he has supported it. He has supported everything that Israel has done, and only recently started saying maybe Israel's killing a few too many civilians. We are not standing up to what is an intent to genocide. You know, as one Omer Bartov, who's one of the world's leading experts in the study of genocide, says it's not genocide yet. Well, it's never genocide until the genocide is done. So if you want to stop it, you have to throw that term out before it gets there. And he, you know, Bartov said, if Israel keeps doing what they're doing, this will be genocide. So we should be treating it as genocide, and we should be standing up and saying this has to stop. We actually have an opportunity, which we have often not had, at least to this extent in the past, to stop genocide before it becomes complete. And you know, not only are we not taking advantage of that opportunity, we're encouraging the genocide. And I think that's monstrous.
But what can we do? What can be done now that you mentioned it?
Well, I think the other component to Mitchell's astute analysis is that we're funding part of this genocide. And this is what I think is important for any audience member that is American and that is an American citizen that has a right to vote, and an American resident who pays taxes, is that it's one thing to politically oppose the actions, the human rights violations or war crimes of a state or non-state actor. It's a whole different level of culpability to fund it. $3.8 billion a year. And a request by Biden for $14 billion more. And Biden has just recently found a means of providing hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel without having to go through Congress. And this means that Americans have blood on their hands. We are directly responsible because we're funding it, which I think, again, is much more egregious than just politically supporting it. And that means that we have to demand that this stops. I just want to know, for those in the audience who may not agree with my positions, is switch out the actors and ask yourself how you would respond. If everything else was the same and it was Black people doing it to white people, right? Africans doing it to white or European people, if it was Muslims doing it to Jews or Muslims doing it to Christians, everything is exactly the same, but just switch out the groups of Hamas and the Israeli government. There would be no doubt that the money would immediately cease, at least in the short term and possibly permanently. So again, the evidence is so clear of the double standards that are infected by racism and infected by global white supremacy, because the Israeli government has, to its credit, very effectively persuaded the American government and the American people over the past 8 decades that Israel is white, that Israel is a European outpost, an American outpost in the Middle East, that it is civilized, that it is liberal, that it is effectively just a version of a European country or American country in the Middle East among brown, savage Muslim people. And as a result, it experiences as a state white privilege, right? White, in this case, white Judeo-Christian privilege that allows it to violate indiscriminately war crimes and be excused for it and be justified. Whereas when Hamas commits war crimes, it is rightfully condemned, but even worse, their crimes are then imputed upon 2.2 million Palestinian civilians. And as a result, you have Israel committing war crimes from denial of food, starvation, denial of water, dehydration, intentional destruction of the medical system, where you have over 60% of hospitals have been destroyed and arguably even more. And it was very intentional. The indiscriminate bombings of entire neighborhoods and the forcible displacement of 1.5 million people, and statements that said, we want you to go to Egypt, we want to destroy you and get rid of you. And the agenda of trying to forcibly ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai that is controlled by Egypt is no secret. So this was effectively, they used the Hamas attacks as a pretext for the final solution. And that final solution, from the perspective of the Israeli government, for Gaza is to kill as many Palestinians and ethnically cleanse anyone that's left alive into Sinai. That is their final solution.
Okay,
and we're funding it with our money.
I've spoken to many Congress people before there were Congress people, when there are Congress people, who say, oh, I agree with you. It's really sad what's happening to Palestinians, but this is not a politically tenable viewpoint or something like that. How much of that is BS and how much of that do they have a point on?
I mean, the thing about politics and trying to figure out what is politically possible, perception is reality. So there's a couple of things. Now, how do you build perception? I mean, to some extent, you have to build that perception with reality. The pro-Israel lobby is exceedingly good at its job, even beyond the fact that it's exceedingly well funded. Just aside from the funding that they have, the amount of money they can mobilize in targeted local elections, which is what they do. They don't necessarily go all in on every election, or even most elections. They target specific elections. So if you are a member of Congress, and you are somebody who they think they can get out of office, like the last election, they didn't really try very hard to get Ilhan Omar out of office, and she actually only won kept her seat fairly narrowly, and a lot of people kind of turned on them and said you miscalculated. But they go after targeted, specific targets. They pour tons of money into it. They may try to, depending on the race, they may try to primary they may try to win the primaries. They may try to win in the general, depending on, again, and they're very good at political strategy. They are also really, really well funded. All of these things are true. But in the end, okay, you get reelected as a member of Congress, not with money, but with votes. The person who spends the most money in these races does not always win. There are plenty of examples actually of people being outspent and still winning because their message, they were still able to get their message out, and it resonated with people, and people wanted to vote for them, and they knew their district or whatever it may be. So there's a mix here. I think there's a lot of space. We can see it in the polls. There's a lot of space to go off the Israel lobby script on the matter of Israel. There are certainly people in certain districts who cannot do that, whether they want to or not. That is, I'm not going to break down all 450 districts, of course, but there are districts where you can do it, districts where you can't. But even the ones where you can, they're scared. I think we saw this, with a very young member of Congress, Maxwell Frost, who's a Congress member in Florida. He was only 25. He ran mostly about an issue that has nothing to do with the Middle East, which is guns in the United States, and which is its own. We can talk about that for hours, but. And he had initially been strongly supportive of the Palestinian cause in fairly radical terms. He was part of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, all these things. And he extremely watered down his position in order to not aggravate or draw the attention of the Israel lobby. Many of his constituents that I've spoken to, many of the people who used to be his campaign staff, who then quit, said this is a terrible miscalculation. He did not have to do this. That may be true, but one of the things that AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobby groups do is for the most part, when they target a candidate, they don't talk about Israel at all. They don't say we're targeting you because you're not good on Israel. They create advertisements and they put out political rhetoric on other issues that they know they can attack the candidate on, that the voters in that district actually care about, because sadly, most Americans don't really care very much about foreign policy and foreign affairs at all. And that's not what makes them vote. Even Jews, we have seen, where does Israel rank among Jewish voters? Standard Jewish voters, not anti-Zionist Jews, just Jewish voters. It's always at the bottom of the list, with very few people saying it's the most important thing to them. So most Americans vote on domestic issues, so that's where they go. So there's a reality, but this is a lobby that can be confronted because it's a foreign policy lobby. It is a a lobby that is very dishonest, and we've seen them attacked for this. We've seen, particularly among Democrats, we've seen Bernie Sanders and others go after them and say, look, they're funding the right wing. They're funding right-wing candidates to unseat Democrats and telling you it's better for the Democratic Party, telling Democrats to vote for them, that they are basically scamming people. They are largely, they'll put money into primary races in the Democratic Party that come from major right-wing Republican donors. That can be exposed. You can attack them in this way. There's ways you can stand up to them. Look, any political move is a gamble one way or the other. No one guarantees your seat. No one guarantees you winning an election. But I think there's a lot more space than to disagree and to confront the Israel lobby than most politicians take advantage of, because most politicians, let's face it, are cowards.
You have a comment, Sahar?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize how this issue exposes a broader systematic problem with American politics, and more specifically the corruption that infects our political system. That's not unique to Zionist special interest groups, but we see it with abortion rights, with gun rights, with all sorts of what we call culture war issues. Is we as Americans have got to take seriously the problem, the infection, the disease of corruption in our electoral political system. It is disconcerting to know that our politicians are voting based on the donations of a small group of people or organizations or corporations, not based on polling or surveys of their constituencies, or based on their own policy platforms that they openly communicate to their constituencies who then elect them or unelect them. And that is not democracy. That is effectively a lighter version of autocracy, insofar as a small group of people and organizations who have money can then control some of the most important policy issues in the country. And so that, I think, is something we all need to continue to grapple with. And this issue with the Zionist lobby or the special interest groups that are unconditionally supportive of Israel, regardless of what international laws it violates, is just one example of that. And I think one that is a deadly example for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. But we need to put it into a broader context, just like we're putting the report that we talked about, that we wrote, within the broader context of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Oftentimes these types of political crises provide us with insights into kind of the deeper or deeply rooted structural problems that we have in our society.
And my one final question for both of you is, for people in the audience who've listened to this episode and who want to learn more or be more involved, where should they go? How do you guys have any website?
Yes, we have multiple social media accounts for the Center for Security, Race. Right. So the Center for Security, Race, and Rights has an Instagram account, Rutgers CSRR, Twitter, RUCSRR, as well as Facebook, RUCSRR. But most importantly, please visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where we have the report featured on the front page on the banner. And follow me on my personal Twitter account at Sahar Aziz Law. And hopefully you will continue to learn from the various programs that we do at the center.
Thank you so much. And I would love to have both of you back again, because like I said, I didn't know about these two books, which I will definitely read and get back to you.
So just really quickly, people can also, yes, and if you forget any of the websites, you can just look up presumptively
description box.
Okay, presumptively anti-Semitic, and you can follow me on Twitter at MJ Plitnik. And you can also follow my writing at my website, rethinkingforeignpolicy.org.
Okay. And thank you so much. And I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Today we have two wonderful faculty members from
hi.
Hey, we're back.
We're back. Yeah. Okay. So the nice thing about winter here is that it's almost it's almost 8 a.m. And let me see if I can do a quick turn to the window. See how dark it is? It's almost like midnight. So the winter is like great for sleeping because the sun doesn't come out till 9 or maybe 10. Well, soon it'll, like on solstice day, it's not going to come out until 10 and going to go out at 3. And if you're in Murmansk, winter solstice is just dark all day long. But summertime is hellish because at midnight itself, the sun starts coming out, and the sun just went down at 11 p.m. And so,
So, Artsy, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Wow, I can see the difference. The light is shining through the trees now. You didn't have that before.
Yeah, exactly. I added a bunch of rays of light and then a lot of stuff in the foreground because I added shadow here, and that it has to dry before I can do any of like the light effects on the trees. So yeah. But
what are you doing? Sorry, what are you doing with your phone when I noticed you look through your phone when you were looking at it and you were using your phone?
I have pictures that I took of a local tree. That's what a lot of my trees are inspired by. So I have been using that just kind of as a general reference for the branches and such.
Okay, so you're using your your I don't know, your extra picture, your picture of what you're going off of.
Yeah. I live in Yucatan, and the foliage here is so beautiful. It's incredibly inspiring. So I'm always finding different beautiful pieces of nature that I want to paint as I'm walking around.
Yeah. You've been there for over a year, right? Or something?
Yeah, almost 2 years actually.
Moving to,
next time I come back to the Western Hemisphere, I'll come and visit you because I love.
Oh, that would be awesome. You'd love it here.
Oh, no, I know. I've been there many times. Like Mexico is one of my favorite countries in the world.
Oh, you've been to Yucatan?
Yeah, I've been to almost lots of places in Mexico. I've been to.
That's awesome.
I'll start singing soon about Mexico linda tierra, el amor de mis amores, con sus lindas mujeres, una flor entre flores.
Yep, you nailed it.
I went to the city and then we went to Acapulco and then I went to Mazatlan. So that's not really.
Mazatlan is. I've been to Mazatlan. I loved it.
Yeah, Acapulco was weird. It was weird. I was only like 13 or 14 when I went to Acapulco.
That's incredibly high.
Yeah, I haven't been to Acapulco, but I have been to Mazatlan. So, but I've been in León. I used to live in León, Guanajuato, and so I really hope to be doing more traveling so I can see some of these places that I haven't been yet.
Yeah.
Nice. So, what else is going on in this pit? Like, what else do you have left to do on this?
So this type of tree that I'm painting has these absolutely beautiful purple flowers. It almost looks like a lilac tree, but it's not. So I'm going to be adding, both the leaves and then these beautiful flowers that are all over the tree. I'm going to be adding more to the foreground, probably some sort of animal life because I always do that. But I haven't decided what yet because this piece is partially inspired by here and also partially inspired by elsewhere.
Oh, so it's like you have to wait until this layer dries before you can start the new add-ons?
Yeah. I use a lot of texture when I'm painting with acrylics. So if you go over it too fast, acrylics dry a heck of a lot quicker than oils, but if you go over it too quickly, it'll smear all over and get muddy. So I really make sure that it's dry before I go over and add stuff.
So how many days does it take for it to be really dry for you to restart the painting?
Oh, this will be dry within a half hour. And some areas, like if you're doing thin paint, it'll be dry within literally minutes. Literally, as you're painting with acrylics, it will be drying on your palette. So you have to paint as fast as you can so you don't have to remix that color. So, but then the plus side is you get less paint all over because it's not oily based, you know? So each medium has its trade-off.
Why do people use oil? What is the purpose of that?
I mean, oils are wonderful for different reasons. They have a very like translucent sort of effect that they give. It's nice that it doesn't dry quickly because your colors on your palette are usable for hours, if not days, sometimes weeks. So you can just mix it one time and not have to go back and keep trying to match this same color that you mixed before. Plus, they're known to last hundreds of years. There's oil paintings in existence that are like 800 plus years old, whereas acrylics were only developed in the 1950s. And while they've done extensive testing on them and are fairly positive that they're going to last hundreds of years too, they just haven't been around as long to test. So, oils is like the tried and true method. But working with oils is hard because they're toxic. A lot of the pigments are toxic. The mineral spirits and turpentine you use to clean your brushes is toxic. So you've got fumes in the room. As you're painting, you have to keep it ventilated. Try not to touch like the cadmiums and whatnot. So it's all a trade-off, you know. Depends on what I feel like that day.
Blind painting the Sistine Chapel with oil.
Yeah, I actually got my start as a mural artist. I was trained as a mural artist by my mom, who's also a painter, and I've done some murals on the ceiling with her, and it's dripping in your eyes the entire time. I'm glad I was able to use. Yeah, but then I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain. You're already doing so much going up and down ladders all day. You're not really thinking about putting on goggles or anything.
Okay.
So probably would be a good idea though.
Well, okay. So, where can people find you if they want to buy your paintings or see you finish this?
So I'm going to be taking a short half-an-hour break, and then I'm going to start streaming this on my own Twitch, which is at artsy_Marxist. I have my website as well as all of my currently available paintings on Twitter, which is Artsy Marxist, and it's a 1 replacing the I. We'll type it out. And you can pretty much look me up on any platform at Artsy Marxist, and I'm going to be there. So, and then my website is artsymarxist.pixels.com.
It's going to be almost midnight for you, so maybe you should sleep through until the morning before you restart.
Oh no, I always paint usually around midnight till 5 in the morning. That's when I'm like up. So yeah.
Well, I've been up since I woke up at around maybe 8 o'clock in the morning. I've been up for over 24 hours.
Oh my gosh.
She stayed up all night. She did some editing on one of the videos, and she's been up all night.
Oh my, I don't know how you do it. I would not be able to.
I don't know how I do it either. I'm going to crash very soon though, hopefully.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm going to...
Did you want to talk... Sorry. Do you want to do that one last tweet that goes back to the...
Sure, let's do it. Well, we have to compare it with John Podhurst. So let's put up the Podhurst. How do you pronounce his name? Somebody teach me how to pronounce his stupid name.
I like calling him Pudhurst, but I know that's not his name.
Pudhurst, okay.
No, that's what I call him.
Okay.
That's not really his name, though.
Okay, whatever his name is. He's a whiner.
Okay, so there's the slide. So the reason...
Put her tweet first.
Oh, you want the... Okay, hold on. This is the Podhurst.
Okay.
So Podhurst says, this horrible tragedy involving the IDF shooting Israeli hostages reinforces the monstrous war criminality of Hamas. There's a reason the Geneva Conventions require combatants to wear uniforms, and it is exactly this, to make sure civilians are identifiable as civilians.
Now the next tweet.
So then we have... This is actually a Mussolini quote, and it says, "The reason this happens is because Italian partisans dress in civilian clothes, which is a war crime because it makes it extremely difficult to distinguish between civilians and combatants. The death of civilians as a result is by design."
And people say there's no fascism in Israel, and every defender is almost verbatim quoting Mussolini.
I mean, that's everything that's been said has been just like completely. You can find it from Germany or
Ottoman Empire.
the Ottoman Empire, like any
USA,
of them, yeah,
Canada.
It's almost like they're like Joe Biden just plagiarizing these people.
Oh, by the way, I have a really funny. It's not funny, but it's ironic. So Auschwitz. Okay, so there was a team that stole valuables from the dead in Auschwitz. And this team was called the Canada Group. But by the Auschwitz prisoners, and that's really funny because what is a better way to describe Canada than stealing from the people you just genocided?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to translate the whole chapter, but that was just like so funny. Not funny, but it was an astute observation of the nature of Canada.
Yes. So if you want to join Artsy Marxist on her Twitch, she's over there. She's gonna
in 30 minutes.
Oh, in 30 minutes. She'll be.
Yep. And we're gonna make realistically every Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern an ungodly early hour for me. Please tell your friends and family and enemies and tweet it out. Put it on Reddit subreddits.
Yeah,
go troll socialism done left and put it on his flood his things with links.
Asha's going out of her way, like she's doing Friday nights because of the time difference. So
yeah,
we got to get the people over here. So we'll
yeah, go to Rausch's channel, troll and flood with links to me. Yeah, go to all the big channels and flood. Yes. Don't pay them anything, though, of course. Super chats should be reserved for me.
Yes. All for her. All right. So with that, you want to get going and get some sleep?
Yeah. Next Friday, we will be doing the topic of Niger. And because a lot of people are like, junta coup, and they don't understand what it means. Like the price of uranium under the French occupation, they were selling it for like 80 cents per kilogram. Now they're selling it for 250 euros per kilogram.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this because I want to understand it much more than I do. So
yeah, so we'll have some guests from Niger. We'll hopefully have some people who speak French who can translate for us.
We'll get it translated.
And we'll talk about AOCIA and her study abroad in Niamey.
Yeah, nice.
The capital of Niger.
All right.
Is it CIA, AO, or AOC, or AOCIA?
CIA. AOCIA. It's like
AOCIA. Okay.
It always reminds me of EIEIO. So I say it that way. AOCIA.
Okay, yeah, this is really very suspicious. She was in Niamey at a very suspicious time, which makes me wonder about the AOCIA part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
Okay, with that, smrti fascismu, svobodu narodu.
Good night, everyone.
Night, y'all.